The windswept peninsulas and rolling hills of southwestern Wales harboured one of the most distinctive Celtic tribes of pre-Roman Britain. The Demetae occupied a territory that stretched across modern-day Pembrokeshire, Carmarthenshire, and parts of Ceredigion, their settlements scattered across a landscape where Atlantic gales met ancient forests, and where river valleys carved pathways into the heart of their domain. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated society that had established itself firmly in this region by at least the 4th century BC, though their roots likely extend much deeper into the Bronze Age transitions that shaped Celtic Britain. The most striking evidence of Demetae settlement patterns emerges from the numerous hill forts that crown the region's elevated positions. Castell Henlys, perched on a limestone outcrop overlooking the Nevern Valley, represents perhaps the most thoroughly investigated example of their defensive architecture. The site reveals multiple phases of construction spanning several centuries, with its earliest earthworks dating to around 600 BC. The fort's position commanded sweeping views across the valley approaches, while remaining connected to coastal routes that linked the Demetae to maritime trade networks. Excavations have uncovered substantial roundhouses with stone-lined hearths, their walls constructed using the distinctive double-wall technique where an outer stone face contained an inner core of earth and rubble. The strategic positioning of these hill forts reflects a deep understanding of both defensive requirements and economic necessities. Carningley, rising 347 metres above the Nevern Valley, served not merely as a refuge, but as a central node in a communication network that extended across Demetae territory. From its summit, beacon fires could relay messages to other elevated positions, creating a rapid warning system that spanned their entire domain. The fort's interior contained evidence of specialised craft production, including iron working areas where smiths forged the tools and weapons essential to Celtic society. Archaeological investigations at Moel Tregairn have revealed the complexity of these defensive systems. The site features 3 distinct hilltop enclosures, connected by earthwork corridors, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture that could accommodate different phases of threat escalation. During peaceful periods, the outer enclosures housed livestock and provided workspace for seasonal activities. When danger approached, the population could withdraw progressively through the defensive lines, ultimately concentrating within the innermost stronghold, where stored provisions could sustain a prolonged siege. The Demetae social structure reflected the hierarchical patterns common throughout Celtic Britain, yet archaeological evidence suggests certain distinctive characteristics. Elite burials discovered near Llandeilo contain grave goods indicating contact with continental European cultures, including amber beads from the Baltic and glass vessels that likely originated in Gaul. These burials reveal a warrior aristocracy that maintained its status through control of trade networks and military prowess. Bronze mirrors, iron swords with elaborate hilts, and horse harness fittings demonstrate the material wealth that distinguished the tribal elite from common farmers and craftsmen. Warrior culture permeated Demetae society, as evidenced by the numerous weapon deposits found throughout their territory. Iron spears with leaf-shaped blades, designed for both thrusting and throwing, represent the most common weapon type. Swords, though less frequent, display sophisticated metallurgy with pattern-welded blades that combined different iron alloys to create weapons of exceptional strength and flexibility. Shield bosses recovered from ritual deposits show evidence of battle damage, suggesting these items saw actual combat before their ceremonial deposition. The relationship between the Demetae and their neighbouring tribes shaped much of their pre-Roman history. To the east, the Siluris controlled the mountainous regions of what would become Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, their territory extending into the valleys that approached Demetae lands. Archaeological evidence suggests these boundaries remained relatively stable, with buffer zones of sparsely settled upland serving to separate the core territories. Trade goods moved freely across these boundaries, indicating that despite occasional conflicts, economic relationships generally superseded territorial disputes. The Ordovitas, occupying the mountainous interior of Wales, maintained different relationships with the Demetae. Their territory encompassed the challenging terrain of Snowdonia and the central Welsh hills, creating natural barriers that limited direct contact. However, mountain passes facilitated seasonal movement of livestock and goods, particularly during summer months when highland pastures attracted cattle herders from lower elevations. Distinctive pottery styles found at Demetae sites show clear Ordovician influences, suggesting cultural exchange despite geographical separation. Religious practices among the Demetae centred on natural features that dominated their landscape. Rivers held particular significance, serving as boundaries between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. The Teifi, flowing through the heart of their territory, received numerous votive offerings including weapons, jewellery and tools deliberately damaged before deposition. These ritual breakages, known as killing the objects, released their spiritual essence to accompany the offerings into the other world. Sacred groves occupied prominent positions within Demetae territory, their locations often marked by unusual stone arrangements or natural features like springs and rock outcrops. Llanlawer, where a natural spring emerges from limestone cliffs, shows evidence of continuous ritual activity spanning several centuries. Deposits of animal bones, predominantly cattle skulls and horse remains, suggest elaborate sacrifice ceremonies conducted during seasonal festivals. The careful arrangement of these remains indicates formal ritual procedures overseen by specialised religious practitioners. Druidic influence among the Demetae appears less pronounced than among tribes closer to Anglesey, the traditional centre of British Druidism. However, certain archaeological markers suggest contact with Druidic traditions. Ritual shafts, deep pits dug specifically for votive offerings, contain deposits that mirror practices documented at confirmed Druidic sites. These shafts, some extending over 10 metres into bedrock, required substantial communal effort to excavate, indicating organised religious activities directed by established priesthood. The economic foundations of Demetae society rested on a combination of agricultural production, specialised craftsmanship and extensive trade networks. Their territory encompassed some of the most fertile soils in Wales, particularly in the river valleys where alluvial deposits created ideal conditions for grain cultivation. Archaeobotanical evidence from storage pits reveals cultivation of emmer wheat, barley and oats, with field systems extending across valley floors and lower hillsides. Livestock formed an equally important component of their agricultural system. Cattle provided not only meat and dairy products, but also served as measures of wealth and status within Celtic society. Horse breeding appears to have been particularly significant among the Demetae, with skeletal remains indicating animals of substantial size and quality. These horses, essential for both warfare and transportation, represented valuable trade commodities that enhanced the tribe's economic position. Metalworking expertise distinguished Demetae craftsmen throughout the region. Iron ore deposits in the Preseli Hills provided raw materials for tool and weapon production, while skilled smiths developed techniques for creating high-quality implements. Bronze working continued alongside iron production, with artisans creating decorative items, including torques, bracelets, and belt fittings that display the distinctive artistic styles of Celtic Latin culture. Coastal trade networks connected the Demetae to markets extending far beyond Britain's shores. Their harbours along Cardigan Bay and the Bristol Channel facilitated exchange with Irish tribes, particularly those controlling the rich copper mines of County Cork. Archaeological evidence suggests regular contact with continental Europe, including the importation of wine amphorae from Gaul and glass beads from the Rhine Valley. These trade relationships required sophisticated knowledge of seasonal sailing conditions and navigation techniques that allowed Celtic mariners to traverse dangerous waters with remarkable consistency. The Demetae participated in networks that transported goods across vast distances. Cornish tin, essential for bronze production, reached their territory through coastal shipping routes, while Irish gold appeared in elite jewellery found at high-status sites. Salt, crucial for food preservation, was extracted from coastal locations and traded inland to communities throughout Wales. These economic relationships created dependencies that influenced political alliances and shaped the tribe's responses to external pressures. Pottery production among the Demetae developed distinctive regional characteristics while maintaining connections to broader Celtic traditions. Local clays produced vessels with characteristic temper materials that allow archaeologists to identify Demetae pottery at sites throughout Western Britain. Decorative techniques included incised patterns and applied cordons that reflected both functional requirements and aesthetic preferences. Storage jars, cooking pots, and serving vessels show evidence of specialised production techniques that required considerable skill and experience. The sophisticated Celtic world of the Demetae faced its greatest transformation when Roman legions crossed into their territory during the governorship of Sextus Julius Frontinus. The conquest that unfolded between 75 and 78 AD represented not merely a military campaign, but the systematic dismantling of an entire way of life that had evolved over centuries. Frontinus, appointed governor of Britain in 74 AD, inherited the challenging task of completing the subjugation of Wales after his predecessor Quintus Petilius Cerialis had focused primarily on the Brigantes in northern England. The Roman approach to conquering the Demetae differed markedly from their earlier campaigns against the Silures and Ordovices. Frontinus recognised that the Demetae's strategic position, controlling access to the Irish Sea, required careful planning rather than the brutal suppression that had characterised operations in central Wales. Intelligence gathered from traders and diplomatic contacts revealed that the Demetae possessed extensive knowledge of coastal navigation and maintained regular communication with Irish tribes. Disrupting these networks without completely alienating the population demanded a measured approach that balanced military pressure with political inducements. Archaeological evidence from Demetae hill forts reveals the systematic nature of the Roman conquest. At Castel Henles, excavations have uncovered clear destruction layers dating to approximately 76 AD, characterised by burned timber structures and scattered metalwork that suggests hasty abandonment rather than prolonged siege. The destruction patterns indicate that Roman forces employed their standard tactics of surrounding hill forts and cutting off water supplies rather than attempting costly frontal assaults. Ballista bolts recovered from the site's approaches demonstrate the Romans' use of artillery to suppress defenders while maintaining safe distances for their infantry. The conquest proceeded through a carefully orchestrated series of operations that isolated Demetae strongholds from mutual support. Roman engineers constructed temporary camps at strategic intervals, their standardized layouts visible today as crop marks in aerial photography. These camps, typically housing between 2,000 and 4,000 troops, served as secure bases for patrols that gradually extended Roman control across the territory. The camp at Llanio, positioned to control the Teifi Valley crossing, exemplifies this methodical approach. Its substantial earthwork defences and internal structures indicate occupation lasting several months while Roman forces consolidated their hold on the surrounding region. Frontinus demonstrated particular skill in exploiting divisions within Demetae society. Roman historians provide limited details, but archaeological evidence suggests that certain elite families chose accommodation over resistance. Excavations at high-status sites reveal continuity of occupation through the conquest period, with Roman artefacts appearing alongside traditional Celtic materials. These findings indicate that some Demetae nobles successfully negotiated terms that preserved their local authority in exchange for accepting Roman overlordship. The establishment of Roman administrative control centred on the creation of Moridunum as the civitas capital for the Demetae. This settlement, located on the banks of the River Tywee near modern Carmarthen, occupied a position of strategic and economic significance that the Romans quickly recognised. The site controlled river traffic extending inland while remaining accessible to coastal shipping, making it an ideal location for the administrative centre that would govern the former tribal territory. Archaeological investigations have revealed the systematic planning that went into Moradunum's development as a Roman urban centre. The initial military phase of Moradunum's establishment involved constructing a substantial fort capable of housing auxiliary troops responsible for maintaining order throughout the region. This fort, built according to standard Roman specifications, featured stone walls with interval towers and gates positioned to control approaches from all directions. The Principia, or headquarters building, contained administrative offices where military commanders coordinated patrols and managed relationships with local populations. Barracks blocks housed approximately 1,000 auxiliary soldiers, likely recruited from Germanic tribes or other pacified regions of the empire. As Roman control solidified, civilian development gradually expanded around the military installation. The transition from fort to civitas capital occurred over several decades, with archaeological evidence indicating that civilian buildings began appearing outside the fort walls by approximately 90 AD. These early structures followed Roman architectural principles while incorporating local building materials and techniques. Stone foundations supported timber superstructures, with roofing tiles replacing the traditional thatch used in Celtic construction. Hypocaust systems provided central heating for the most important buildings, demonstrating the Romans' commitment to establishing comfortable urban environments, even in remote frontier regions. The Forum and Basilica complex at Moradunum represented the heart of Roman civic life in Demetae territory. Construction of these buildings required importing skilled craftsmen and specialised materials from other parts of the empire. Limestone quarried from local sources provided the primary building material, while lead for pipes and fittings came from mines in the Mendip Hills. The Forum's colonnade created a covered space for commercial activities and public gatherings, while the Basilica housed law courts where Roman magistrates administered justice according to imperial legal codes. Romanization processes among the Demetae unfolded gradually and unevenly across different social levels and geographical areas. The tribal elite, recognizing the advantages of cooperation, often embraced Roman customs most readily. Archaeological evidence from villa sites reveals the adoption of Roman architectural styles, dining customs, and decorative arts among wealthy Demetae families. The villa at Abemagua, constructed during the early 2nd century AD, exemplifies this cultural transformation. Its plan follows standard Roman villa designs, with separate areas for family quarters, guest accommodation, and agricultural processing. Mosaic floors in the main reception rooms displayed geometric patterns and mythological scenes that required skilled craftsmen familiar with Mediterranean artistic traditions. Roman law gradually replaced traditional Celtic legal systems, though the transition involved considerable adaptation to local customs and conditions. The civitas system allowed the Demetae to maintain certain aspects of their traditional governance while operating within Roman legal frameworks. Local magistrates, drawn from prominent Demetae families, administered justice in minor matters, while serious crimes and disputes involving Roman citizens required referral to higher authorities. Legal inscriptions from Moradunum reveal the complexity of this hybrid system, with Latin terminology applied to relationships and obligations that had previously operated according to Celtic custom. Urban planning principles introduced by the Romans transformed settlement patterns throughout Demetae territory. The grid system employed at Moradunum, with streets intersecting at right angles, represented a radical departure from the organic growth patterns of Celtic settlements. Water supply and sewage systems required engineering expertise that local populations gradually acquired through observation and participation in construction projects. Public baths, essential components of Roman urban life, introduced new concepts of hygiene and social interaction that slowly gained acceptance among the Demetae population. Villa construction expanded significantly during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD as Romanization processes accelerated. These rural estates combined agricultural production with comfortable living spaces that reflected their owners' adoption of Roman lifestyle preferences. The villa at Llantwit Major, though located outside core Demetae territory, provides insights into the architectural evolution occurring throughout the region. Its development from a simple rectangular structure to a complex courtyard villa with multiple wings demonstrates the gradual accumulation of wealth and Roman cultural knowledge among the local elite. Integration of local elites into Roman administrative structures required careful balancing of traditional authority with imperial requirements. The Demetae aristocracy that had previously derived status from warfare and cattle raiding needed alternative sources of prestige within the Roman system. Magistracies in the civitas government provided such opportunities, allowing prominent families to maintain their social positions while serving imperial interests. Inscriptions record Demetae nobles holding positions as duumviri, the chief magistrates responsible for local administration, and as priests in the imperial cult that honoured the emperor as a divine figure. Evidence of resistance to Roman rule appears in archaeological contexts that reveal continued adherence to traditional practices despite official pressure for cultural change. Rural settlements often maintained Celtic architectural forms and pottery styles, long after urban areas had adopted Roman alternatives. Ritual deposits in rivers and sacred groves continued throughout the Roman period, suggesting that religious practices proved particularly resistant to change. The Romans generally tolerated such continuity, provided it did not challenge imperial authority or interfere with tax collection and military recruitment. Accommodation between Roman and Celtic cultures produced distinctive hybrid forms that characterized life in Demetae territory throughout the imperial period. Metalworking traditions exemplify this cultural blending, with smiths producing tools and weapons that combined Roman functional designs with Celtic decorative elements. Pottery production similarly evolved to incorporate Roman wheel-thrown techniques while maintaining traditional temper materials and surface treatments. These adaptations allowed local craftsmen to serve both Roman and Celtic markets while preserving technical knowledge that had developed over centuries. The persistence of Demetae cultural identity under Roman rule manifested in various subtle forms that archaeological investigation continues to reveal. Settlement locations often maintained connections to pre-Roman sacred sites, with Roman period buildings positioned to preserve traditional ritual landscapes. Personal names recorded in Latin inscriptions frequently retain Celtic elements, indicating that families maintained awareness of their ancestral heritage, despite adopting Roman legal and social frameworks. Burial practices evolved to incorporate Roman customs while preserving certain Celtic traditions, particularly regarding grave goods and the treatment of cremated remains. Military recruitment among the Demetae provided opportunities for advancement within the Roman system, while creating connections between the local population and the broader empire. Auxiliary units recruited from the tribe served in distant provinces, gaining military experience and cultural exposure that they brought back to their homeland upon retirement. Veterans received land grants and citizenship privileges that enhanced their status within local society, while strengthening ties between the Demetae and Roman imperial structures. Economic transformation under Roman rule fundamentally altered production and exchange patterns that had characterized Celtic society. The introduction of standardized coinage replaced the complex systems of barter and gift exchange that had previously governed economic relationships. Markets operating according to Roman commercial law created new opportunities for agricultural producers while requiring adaptation to unfamiliar trading practices. The development of pottery industries producing Roman-style vessels for local and regional markets demonstrates how traditional crafts evolved to serve changing consumer preferences. The withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain around 410 AD left the former civitas of the Demetae facing unprecedented challenges that would fundamentally reshape their society. As imperial administration collapsed and economic networks disintegrated, the population confronted Saxon raids along the coast, Irish incursions from across the sea, and the breakdown of urban centres that had anchored Roman civilization for over 3 centuries. Yet within this apparent chaos emerged a transformative religious movement that would provide new sources of unity, learning, and cultural identity. Christianity, which had gained modest footholds during the late imperial period, began spreading rapidly through the region via networks of Irish missionaries whose influence would prove far more enduring than Roman political control. The arrival of these Irish missionaries represented part of a broader movement that connected the former Demetae territory to vibrant Christian communities across the Irish Sea. Unlike the hierarchical Roman Church with its emphasis on episcopal authority in urban centres, the Irish model of Christianity emphasised monastic communities that could establish themselves in remote locations while maintaining extensive networks of communication and mutual support. These missionaries brought not only religious teachings, but also practical skills in agriculture, metalworking, and manuscript production that proved invaluable to communities struggling with post-Roman economic disruption. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic establishment of monastic settlements throughout the region during the 5th and early 6th centuries. These foundations typically chose locations that combined practical advantages with symbolic significance, often positioning themselves near sacred springs or ancient stone monuments that had held religious meaning for the Celtic population. The monastery at Llantwit Major, though technically outside core Demetae territory, provides insights into the architectural and organisational principles that characterised these early Christian communities. Its buildings followed a distinctive pattern with a central church surrounded by individual cells for monks, workshops for various crafts, and agricultural buildings that supported the community's economic needs. The most significant of these early foundations emerged at what would become St. David's, where a monastic community established itself on a peninsula that jutted into the Irish Sea. This location, known in Welsh as Minneala, possessed strategic advantages that made it ideal for a religious centre with international connections. The site's position near the western extremity of Wales provided natural protection from land-based attacks while remaining accessible to maritime traffic from Ireland, Cornwall, and Brittany. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of continuous religious activity at the site, extending back to pre-Christian times, suggesting that the Christian foundation deliberately chose to build upon existing sacred associations. The establishment of the St. David's Monastery involved careful planning that reflected both practical requirements and theological principles. The community positioned its buildings within a natural depression that provided shelter from Atlantic storms while creating a sense of enclosure appropriate for contemplative life. A central church, constructed using local stone with timber roofing, served as the focal point for communal worship and housed relics that attracted pilgrims from across the Celtic world. Surrounding this central structure, individual stone cells provided private spaces for prayer and study, their small windows oriented to capture optimal light for manuscript copying and other scholarly activities. The monastery's economic foundation rested on sophisticated agricultural systems that maximise productivity from the peninsula's limited arable land. Terraced fields carved into hillsides allowed cultivation of grains despite challenging topography, while extensive pastures supported livestock herds that provided meat, dairy products, and materials for manuscript production. The community developed expertise in managing coastal resources, including seaweed harvesting for fertilizer and salt production from evaporated seawater. These activities required coordinated labour that reinforced the communal bonds essential to monastic life, while creating economic surpluses that supported the monastery's educational and missionary activities. The figure of Dewi Sant, known in English as Saint David, emerged as the most influential religious leader of this period, though separating historical facts from later legendary accretions presents considerable challenges. Contemporary sources provide limited information about his actual life, but archaeological evidence and early hagiographical materials suggest he lived approximately from 500 to 589 AD and played a crucial role in establishing the institutional foundations of Welsh Christianity. His reputation for ascetic practices and evangelical zeal attracted disciples from throughout the Celtic world, creating networks of affiliated monasteries that extended his influence far beyond the immediate vicinity of St. David's. The monastic rule attributed to St. David emphasized extreme asceticism that distinguished his communities from other contemporary Christian foundations. Monks following his precepts reportedly subsisted on bread, vegetables, and water, while engaging in demanding physical labour that included pulling ploughs themselves rather than using oxen. These practices, while perhaps exaggerated in later accounts, reflected genuine theological principles that viewed physical hardship as essential for spiritual development. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites associated with the Davidian tradition reveals simple living conditions with minimal material possessions, supporting the historical reality of these ascetic practices. St. David's influence extended through his establishment of daughter houses that carried his monastic principles to other regions. The monastery at Llandelo Fawr, positioned strategically in the Tiwi Valley, became one of the most important of these foundations. Its location provided access to river transportation, while commanding approaches to the interior valleys where scattered populations maintained traditional Celtic lifestyles. The community there developed particular expertise in manuscript production, creating copies of biblical texts and theological works that circulated throughout Wales and beyond. Excavations at the site have revealed sophisticated scriptoriums with specialised furniture for manuscript copying and extensive libraries that preserved classical learning through the early medieval period. The parallel career of St. Taylo illustrates the collaborative nature of early Welsh Christianity and the complex relationships between different monastic traditions. Taylo, whose historical existence appears more securely documented than David's, established his primary foundation at Llandilo Fawr around 520 AD. His approach to monasticism emphasised pastoral care and community engagement, rather than the extreme asceticism associated with the Davidian tradition. Archaeological evidence suggests that Taylo's monasteries maintained closer connections to surrounding secular settlements, providing medical care, education, and agricultural advice that enhanced their integration into local society. Taylo's reputation as a healer attracted pilgrims from across Wales and Ireland, creating economic opportunities that supported his monastic foundations while spreading Christian influence throughout the region. His monasteries developed sophisticated knowledge of herbal medicine, combining traditional Celtic healing practices with Christian theological frameworks that interpreted illness and recovery in terms of divine intervention. Manuscript fragments preserved at Llandelo Fawr contain detailed medical prescriptions that reveal the practical application of the synthesis between pagan and Christian healing traditions. The third major figure of this early Christian period, Saint Padan, established his principal monastery at Llanbadarn Fawr in what is now Ceredigion. His foundation, dating to approximately 545 AD, occupied a strategic position that controlled access to the interior valleys while maintaining connections to coastal trade routes. Padan's background as a member of the Demetae nobility provided him with political connections that proved crucial for securing royal patronage and protecting his monastic communities from secular interference. Archaeological investigations at Llanbadarn Fawr have revealed evidence of substantial royal donations including high-quality metalwork and imported goods that demonstrate the monastery's elevated status within early Welsh society. The development of these major ecclesiastical centres created focal points of power that gradually replaced the secular strongholds that had dominated the region during the Roman period. Unlike the hill forts of pre-Roman times, or the administrative centres of the imperial era, these monastic foundations derived their authority from spiritual rather than military sources. Their libraries preserved classical learning and Christian theology, while their schools trained successive generations of clergy who would carry Christian influence throughout Wales and beyond. The economic resources controlled by these monasteries, including extensive land grants from royal patrons, provided them with material foundations that supported their spiritual and educational activities. The process of Christianization involved complex negotiations between new religious teachings and established Celtic traditions that had shaped regional identity for centuries. Rather than attempting to eradicate pre-existing beliefs entirely, Christian missionaries often adapted pagan practices to Christian purposes, creating syncretic forms that eased the transition for local populations. Sacred wells, which had served as focal points for Celtic religious practices, received Christian dedications that preserved their ritual significance while redirecting their spiritual associations. The well at Finnandewy near St David's exemplifies this adaptive process, with archaeological evidence indicating continuous ritual use from pre-Christian times through the medieval period. Stone monuments presented particular challenges for Christian missionaries seeking to redirect pagan religious practices. The numerous standing stones and stone circles scattered throughout former Demetae territory had served as markers for ancient ritual activities and territorial boundaries. Rather than destroying these monuments, Christian communities often incorporated them into their own sacred landscapes by carving crosses onto existing stones or positioning new Christian monuments in relationship to ancient ones. The Nevern Cross, a magnificent 10th century stone cross positioned near earlier pagan monuments, demonstrates how Christian craftsmen created new religious art that acknowledged while transforming the sacred significance of ancient sites. The establishment of Christian burial practices required particularly sensitive handling of traditional Celtic beliefs about death and the afterlife. Celtic traditions had involved elaborate funeral rites that included grave goods intended to accompany the deceased into the other world, along with ritual feasting that maintained connections between living and dead community members. Christian teachings about resurrection and eternal life offered alternative understandings of death that gradually gained acceptance. But archaeological evidence reveals that the transition occurred slowly and unevenly across different social levels and geographical areas. Early Christian cemeteries in the region typically positioned themselves near monastic foundations or ancient sacred sites, creating continuity with traditional burial locations while introducing new ritual practices. Excavations at these sites reveal gradual changes in burial orientation, gravegood deposition, and monument construction that reflect the slow adoption of Christian practices. The cemetery at Llantwit Major shows clear evidence of this transition, with earlier burials following traditional Celtic patterns, while later interments conformed to Christian requirements for east-west orientation and minimal grave goods. The preservation and transmission of Celtic cultural traditions within Christian frameworks created distinctive forms of artistic expression that characterised Welsh Christianity throughout the early medieval period. Manuscript illumination combined Christian iconography with Celtic decorative motifs, producing works of extraordinary beauty that preserve traditional artistic techniques while serving new religious purposes. The scribes working in Welsh monasteries developed distinctive letter forms and decorative schemes that reflected their cultural heritage while communicating Christian theological concepts. Metalworking traditions similarly evolved to serve Christian communities while maintaining connections to pre-Christian artistic traditions. The production of liturgical vessels, reliquaries, and personal ornaments for clergy required sophisticated technical skills that built upon centuries of Celtic metalworking expertise. Archaeological finds from monastic sites include bronze bells, silver chalices, and gold jewellery that demonstrate the continuation of traditional craft techniques within Christian contexts. These objects often incorporated symbolic elements that functioned simultaneously within Celtic and Christian interpretive frameworks, allowing craftsmen to serve their new religious communities while preserving ancestral artistic knowledge. The role of women in early Welsh Christianity reflected both Christian teachings about spiritual equality and traditional Celtic attitudes toward female religious authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that several major monasteries included communities of religious women who maintained separate but related foundations near male monastic centres. These communities, while less well documented than their male counterparts, played crucial roles in preserving textile arts, manuscript copying, and medical knowledge that supported the broader Christian mission throughout the region. The economic transformation accompanying Christianization created new patterns of land ownership and resource management that would shape Welsh society for centuries. Monastic foundations received extensive grants from royal patrons seeking spiritual benefits, accumulating landed wealth that provided economic security while creating obligations to support royal interests. These relationships between secular and religious authority established precedents for church-state cooperation that would influence Welsh political development throughout the medieval period. The educational activities of monastic communities created the first systematic schools in post-Roman Wales, attracting students from across the Celtic world who came to study Christian theology, classical literature, and practical skills. These schools preserved Latin literacy while developing vernacular Welsh literary traditions that would flourish in subsequent centuries. The libraries maintained by major monasteries collected manuscripts from Ireland, Gaul, and other Christian centres, creating repositories of learning that served as intellectual foundations for Welsh cultural development. The collapse of Roman administrative structures around 410 AD created a political vacuum that local Romano-British elites quickly moved to fill, transforming the former civitas of the Demetae into an independent British kingdom that would become known as Dyfed. This transition represented neither a sudden break nor a simple restoration of pre-Roman Celtic governance, but rather a complex evolution that combined Roman institutional knowledge with traditional Welsh political practices. The emerging kingdom drew its legitimacy from both the administrative expertise of Romano-British families who had served in the imperial bureaucracy and the ancestral claims of Celtic noble lineages that had maintained their status throughout the Roman period. Archaeological evidence from Carmarthen, the former Moridunum, reveals the systematic adaptation of Roman urban infrastructure to serve new political requirements. The basilica complex that had housed imperial courts continued functioning as a centre of royal administration, though its internal arrangements underwent significant modification. Stone-built offices that had previously accommodated Roman magistrates were reconfigured to house the household officials of Welsh kings, while the Forum remained in use as a gathering place for assemblies that combined Roman legal procedures with traditional Celtic methods of dispute resolution. Excavations have uncovered coin hoards dating to the mid-5th century that suggest local authorities continued collecting taxes according to Roman precedents, though the revenues now supported indigenous rulers rather than distant imperial officials. The Romano-British elite families that facilitated this transition possessed crucial advantages in navigating the complexities of post-imperial governance. Their familiarity with Latin literacy enabled them to maintain written records and communicate with other emerging kingdoms throughout Britain, while their understanding of Roman law provided frameworks for organising territorial administration. These families had typically held positions as decurions in the civitas government, giving them practical experience in tax collection, judicial proceedings, and military organisation that proved invaluable during the uncertain decades following Roman withdrawal. The integration of these Romano-British administrators with traditional Celtic nobility created hybrid governing structures that characterised early Dived. Inscribed stones from this period reveal the adoption of Roman titles and nomenclature by Welsh rulers who simultaneously claimed descent from pre-Roman tribal leaders. The Vertporic stone, discovered near Castel Dwyran, commemorates a king whose name follows Celtic linguistic patterns, while his memorial inscription employs Latin formulae typical of Roman administrative documents. This bilingual approach to royal identity reflected the practical necessity of appealing to both Romanized urban populations and traditional rural communities that had maintained Celtic cultural practices throughout the imperial period. The territorial boundaries of emerging Dived reflected both geographical constraints and political negotiations with neighbouring kingdoms that were undergoing similar transformations. The eastern frontier, with what would become Brycheiniog, followed the watershed divide of the Cambrian Mountains, a natural boundary that had separated different tribal territories since pre-Roman times. Archaeological evidence suggests that hillforts along this frontier were reoccupied during the 5th century, indicating renewed concern with territorial defence as centralised Roman military protection disappeared. Dinas Powys, though located outside Dived proper, provides insights into the defensive strategies employed by these early Welsh kingdoms, with its substantial earthwork fortifications and evidence of high-status occupation, suggesting that elite families were consolidating control over strategic positions. The relationship between Dived and Ceredigion to the north involved complex negotiations over control of the Teifi Valley, a crucial corridor that connected coastal regions with the interior uplands. The river itself served as a natural boundary, but its fertile valley lands attracted competing claims from both kingdoms. Archaeological investigation of settlement sites along the Teifi reveals evidence of fortified homesteads that appear to have changed hands multiple times during the 5th and 6th centuries, suggesting ongoing territorial disputes that were resolved through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic agreements. The eventual stabilization of this frontier reflected the emergence of effective governmental structures capable of enforcing territorial claims and maintaining peaceful relationships with neighbouring rulers. The northern boundary with Gwynedd presented different challenges, as the powerful kingdom centred on Anglesey possessed superior military resources and more extensive territorial claims. The princes of Gwynedd, descendants of Cunedda who had migrated from northern Britain, established themselves as the dominant power in northwestern Wales during the late 5th century. Their expansion southward created pressure on Dived's northern territories, leading to conflicts that are documented in later Welsh genealogical texts and suggested by archaeological evidence of destroyed settlements in the border regions. The resolution of these territorial disputes required Dived's rulers to acknowledge Gwynedd's superior status while maintaining their independence within clearly defined boundaries. The royal genealogies preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts provide crucial insights into the claimed origins of Dived's ruling dynasty, though their historical accuracy remains debated among scholars. These genealogies consistently trace the kingdom's royal line to Eochaid al Muir, identified with Aed Brosg, an Irish prince who allegedly established his authority in southwestern Wales during the late 4th or early 5th century. The name Eochaid al Muir, meaning Eochaid from overseas, suggests an Irish origin that aligns with archaeological evidence for increased Irish cultural influence in the region during this period. The circumstances surrounding Eochaid al Muir's arrival and establishment of power remain obscure, but several factors suggest that his success resulted from a combination of military capability and strategic alliances rather than simple conquest. Irish settlements in Wales during this period typically involved relatively small groups of warriors and their followers who integrated themselves into existing political structures rather than displacing established populations entirely. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites in Pembrokeshire reveals increased quantities of Irish-style artefacts during the 5th century, including distinctive pottery forms and metalwork that suggest sustained cultural contact rather than isolated raids. The integration of Irish political traditions with Romano-British administrative practices created distinctive governmental structures that characterised early Dived. Irish legal concepts, particularly regarding kinship obligations and territorial organisation, provided frameworks for organising rural communities that had limited exposure to Roman institutional practices. The Tuath system of Irish governance, which organised territory around extended kinship groups, adapted well to the scattered settlement patterns that characterised much of southwestern Wales. These Irish influences appear most clearly in legal terminology preserved in later Welsh law codes, where concepts of family responsibility and collective land ownership reflect Irish rather than Roman precedents. The marriage alliances that connected Dived's ruling family to other Welsh kingdoms and Irish Tuatha created networks of political relationship that stabilised the emerging kingdom while extending its influence beyond its immediate territorial boundaries. The genealogical texts record marriages between Dived princes and daughters of rulers in Brycheiniog, Gwent and various Irish kingdoms, suggesting systematic diplomatic efforts to secure the dynasty's position through kinship connections. These alliances provided mutual defence agreements and trade relationships that enhanced Dived's economic prosperity, while reducing the likelihood of military conflicts with neighbouring powers. The archaeological record reveals significant changes in settlement patterns during Dived's formative period that reflect both political consolidation and economic adaptation to post-Roman conditions. The abandonment of many Roman villa sites during the 5th century coincided with the establishment of new high-status settlements positioned to control strategic routes and defensive positions. Lis Brychan, a fortified residence excavated near Llandeilo, exemplifies these new royal centres with its combination of substantial defensive earthworks and comfortable residential buildings that incorporated both Roman architectural techniques and Celtic spatial arrangements. These royal centres typically featured great halls constructed using timber framing techniques that drew upon both Roman engineering knowledge and traditional Celtic building methods. Archaeological evidence from similar sites throughout Wales reveals halls capable of accommodating several hundred people for ceremonial feasts and political assemblies, indicating the continuation of Celtic traditions that emphasised royal hospitality and public display of wealth. The halls at these sites often incorporated hypocaust heating systems adapted from Roman models, demonstrating the preservation of technical knowledge despite the collapse of imperial administration. The material culture recovered from these elite sites reveals sophisticated craft production that combined traditional Celtic artistic traditions with new influences from Ireland and continental Europe. Metalworking continued at a high level, with smiths producing elaborate jewellery, weapons and horse harness fittings that displayed the wealth and status of their royal patrons. The discovery of crucibles containing traces of gold and silver indicates that precious metalworking remained active, while iron production supplied the weapons and tools necessary for both military activities and agricultural development. Pottery production during this period shows clear evidence of cultural continuity combined with new influences that reflect Dived's changing political and economic relationships. Local potters continued producing vessels using traditional techniques and decorative schemes, but new forms appeared that show Irish influence in their shapes and surface treatments. The appearance of imported pottery from Gaul and the eastern Mediterranean at high-status sites demonstrates that long-distance trade networks, though reduced from Roman levels, continued operating throughout the transitional period. The continuation of urban life at Carmarthen, albeit on a reduced scale, provided crucial stability during the political transformations of the 5th and 6th centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population declined significantly from Roman levels, but core areas of the town remained occupied and maintained basic urban functions. Craft workshops continued operating within the former commercial districts, producing goods for both local consumption and regional trade. The survival of stone buildings provided ready-made infrastructure for the royal administration, while the town's position on the Taiwi continued to make it an important centre for river and coastal trade. The relationship between Christian monastic foundations and secular royal authority created new forms of political legitimacy that distinguished Dived from purely secular kingdoms. The establishment of St. David's as a major ecclesiastical centre provided the kingdom with international prestige, while creating diplomatic connections to other Christian rulers throughout the Celtic world. Royal patronage of monastic foundations demonstrated piety while securing spiritual support for dynastic claims, creating mutually beneficial relationships between church and state that would characterise Welsh politics for centuries. The economic foundations of early Dyfed combined traditional agricultural production with new commercial opportunities created by the kingdom's strategic position, controlling access to the Irish Sea. Cattle raising remained the primary form of wealth, with royal herds serving both as economic resources and symbols of political power. The development of seasonal markets at royal centres facilitated trade between pastoral communities and craft specialists, while coastal harbours maintained connections to Irish and continental trading networks that brought luxury goods and raw materials into the kingdom. The preservation of Latin literacy within monastic communities enabled Dyfed's rulers to maintain written records and conduct diplomatic correspondence with other kingdoms throughout Britain and Ireland. This administrative capability provided significant advantages in territorial negotiations and legal disputes, while the production of royal charters and legal documents created permanent records of political agreements and property transfers. The combination of Irish oral traditions with Roman written practices created distinctive documentary forms that would influence Welsh legal and administrative development throughout the medieval period. The consolidation of royal authority under Cecil ap Clydog around 650 AD marked the beginning of Dyfed's Golden Age as an independent Welsh kingdom. Cecil's reign established administrative precedents and territorial boundaries that would endure for over 2 centuries, transforming the loose confederation of Romano-British and Irish-influenced territories into a cohesive political entity capable of competing with the major powers of early medieval Wales. His court at Dynefar, positioned strategically on a limestone bluff overlooking the Tywi Valley, became the focal point for a sophisticated governmental system that balanced traditional Celtic kinship obligations with the practical requirements of territorial administration. Archaeological excavations at Dynefar have revealed the systematic expansion of royal facilities during Cecil's reign, with new construction projects that reflected both increased wealth and growing political ambitions. The Great Hall, rebuilt using imported oak timbers and decorated with carved panels displaying royal genealogies, could accommodate over 300 guests during the ceremonial feasts that reinforced political alliances and demonstrated royal magnificence. Metalwork recovered from the site's occupation layers includes silver-gilt brooches and gold arm rings that display sophisticated craftsmanship, combining Irish artistic motifs with Anglo-Saxon technical innovations, indicating the kingdom's participation in cultural exchange networks spanning the Irish Sea and beyond. The reign of Rain ap Cadogan, who succeeded to the throne around 680 AD, represented the zenith of early medieval Dyfed's political influence and territorial expansion. Rain inherited a kingdom whose boundaries had stabilised along natural frontiers, but his military campaigns extended Dyfed's authority into contested border regions that had previously remained under the control of neighbouring kingdoms. His conquest of the Gower Peninsula from Gwent involved a series of coordinated operations that demonstrated sophisticated military planning and logistical capabilities previously unseen in Welsh warfare of this period. The campaign for Gower unfolded through careful preparation that included diplomatic negotiations with Irish allies, who provided naval support for coastal operations. Archaeological evidence from hill forts along the peninsula's spine reveals destruction layers dating to approximately 685 AD, with burned timber structures and scattered weapons indicating fierce resistance from Gwent's garrison forces. The systematic nature of these destructions suggests that Rayne's forces employed siege techniques learned from contact with Anglo-Saxon military practices, including the use of battering rams and coordinated infantry assaults that overwhelmed traditional Celtic defensive strategies. Rayne's territorial acquisitions required new administrative arrangements that extended Dyfed's governmental structures across a significantly enlarged kingdom. The establishment of subordinate courts at strategic locations throughout the expanded territory created a hierarchical system of authority that maintained royal control while accommodating local variations in custom and law. The court at Llanstefan, positioned to oversee the newly acquired Gower territories, operated under appointed officials who reported directly to Dynevor, while maintaining sufficient autonomy to address regional concerns and disputes. The economic implications of territorial expansion became apparent in the archaeological record through increased quantities of imported goods at royal sites and evidence of expanded craft production centres. The metalworking complex at Dynevor grew substantially during Rayne's reign, with new workshops producing weapons and luxury goods for the expanded royal household and its military retainers. Crucible fragments containing traces of silver and gold indicate that precious metal working reached new levels of sophistication, while iron production supplied the weapons necessary to equip larger military forces capable of defending the kingdom's extended boundaries. Rayne's court attracted craftsmen and scholars from across the Celtic world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that fostered cultural innovation while preserving traditional Welsh artistic traditions. Manuscript fragments recovered from Dynevor's destruction layers reveal the presence of a substantial library containing works in Latin, Irish, and early Welsh, suggesting that the royal court maintained scholarly activities alongside its political and military functions. The production of illuminated manuscripts at the court combined Irish decorative techniques with Welsh linguistic traditions, creating distinctive artistic forms that influenced manuscript production throughout Wales. The development of royal centres beyond Dynevor reflected both practical administrative needs and symbolic assertions of royal authority across Dyfed's territories. Loughaven, established as a secondary residence during the late 7th century, commanded the approaches to the Preseli Hills while providing access to coastal harbours that facilitated communication with Irish allies. Archaeological investigation of the site reveals substantial stone buildings constructed using techniques that combined Roman masonry traditions with contemporary Welsh architectural innovations, creating structures that impressed visitors while providing comfortable accommodation for the peripatetic royal household. The economic foundations of Dyfed's prosperity during this period rested on sophisticated agricultural systems that maximised productivity from the kingdom's diverse environmental zones. The fertile river valleys supported intensive grain cultivation, using ploughing techniques that incorporated iron tools of superior quality, while the upland areas provided extensive pastures for cattle herds that represented the primary form of portable wealth. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals significant improvements in agricultural technology, including the adoption of heavy ploughs capable of working clay soils that had previously remained uncultivated. Cattle raising evolved into a highly organised industry that supplied not only local consumption needs, but also supported extensive trade networks extending throughout Wales and into Ireland. The royal herds, managed by specialised officials who reported directly to the court, numbered in the thousands and required sophisticated systems of pasture management and seasonal movement. Bone assemblages from elite sites reveal consumption of high-quality beef and dairy products, while leatherworking evidence indicates the production of luxury goods, including decorated horse harnesses and ceremonial clothing that displayed royal wealth and status. The patronage of monastic foundations provided Dived's rulers with spiritual legitimacy while creating institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. Royal grants to St. David's during Rayne's reign included extensive landholdings that made the monastery one of the wealthiest ecclesiastical institutions in Wales, while similar endowments to daughter houses throughout the kingdom created networks of religious centres that supported royal authority through prayer and political counsel. The abbots of these foundations, often drawn from royal family branches, served as advisors who provided both spiritual guidance and practical administrative expertise. The scriptorium at St. David's emerged as a major centre for manuscript production during the late 7th and early 8th centuries, creating copies of biblical texts and theological works that circulated throughout the Celtic world. The distinctive Welsh script developed at St. David's combined Irish calligraphic traditions with local innovations, producing manuscripts of exceptional beauty that enhanced the monastery's international reputation. Royal patronage supported this scholarly activity through donations of precious materials, including vellum, gold leaf, and rare pigments that enabled the production of luxury manuscripts suitable for diplomatic gifts and ceremonial use. The cultural achievements of Dyfed during this period extended beyond manuscript production to encompass sophisticated traditions of oral literature that preserved historical memory while entertaining royal courts. The court poets who served Rein ap Cadwagan developed distinctive verse forms that combined praise poetry traditions inherited from pre-Christian Celtic culture with Christian theological concepts and historical narratives. These poems, performed during ceremonial feasts and political gatherings, reinforced royal legitimacy while preserving genealogical information and legal precedents that supported dynastic claims. Archaeological evidence reveals the material prosperity that supported these cultural activities through finds of luxury goods and sophisticated craft products at royal sites throughout the kingdom. Gold jewellery recovered from Dynevor includes elaborate brooches and arm rings decorated with intricate interlace patterns that demonstrate mastery of advanced metalworking techniques, while imported glass vessels and amber beads indicate participation in long-distance trade networks extending to Scandinavia and the Baltic region. The concentration of such wealth at royal centres reflects the effectiveness of tribute collection systems that channeled resources from throughout the kingdom to support royal magnificence. The diplomatic relationships that Rein ap Cadwagan cultivated with neighbouring kingdoms created a complex web of alliances and obligations that stabilised political conditions throughout southwestern Wales. Marriage negotiations with the royal families of Gwynedd and Powys produced agreements that defined territorial boundaries while creating kinship connections that reduced the likelihood of military conflicts. The marriage of Rayne's daughter to Elised ap Gwaelog of Powys around 695 AD established an alliance that protected Dyfed's eastern frontier while providing mutual support against Anglo-Saxon expansion into Wales. These diplomatic arrangements required sophisticated understanding of genealogical relationships and legal precedents that governed interdynastic marriages throughout the Welsh kingdoms. The court officials responsible for negotiating these alliances maintained detailed records of royal genealogies and marriage connections that enabled them to identify potential partners whose unions would strengthen Dyfed's political position without violating kinship prohibitions or creating conflicting territorial claims. The success of these diplomatic efforts contributed significantly to the kingdom's stability and prosperity during the late 7th and early 8th centuries. The relationship with Irish kingdoms across the sea involved both political alliances and commercial partnerships that enriched Dyfed while providing military support when needed. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites reveals increased quantities of Irish artefacts during this period, including distinctive pottery forms and metalwork that indicate regular trading contacts. The harbour at Porthclaise near St David's served as a major entry point for Irish goods and visitors, with excavations revealing substantial stone quays and warehouse buildings that accommodated ships carrying everything from luxury goods to scholarly manuscripts. Irish political refugees occasionally sought sanctuary at Dyfed's court, creating diplomatic complications that required careful handling to avoid antagonising powerful Irish kingdoms while maintaining traditional obligations of hospitality. The presence of these exiled nobles provided Dyfed's rulers with valuable intelligence about Irish political developments, while creating opportunities for intervention in Irish affairs when circumstances proved favourable. The marriage alliances that occasionally resulted from these relationships extended Dyfed's diplomatic influence across the Irish Sea, while providing potential sources of military support during conflicts with other Welsh kingdoms. The legal innovations introduced during Rayne's reign created systematic frameworks for administering justice throughout the expanded kingdom, while preserving local customs that had developed in different regions. The compilation of legal precedents into written codes required collaboration between traditional lawmen who preserved oral legal traditions and literate clerics capable of creating permanent written records. These legal codes, though they survive only in later copies, establish principles of compensation for crimes and procedures for resolving disputes that balanced royal authority with traditional community-based justice systems. The enforcement of royal law throughout Dyfed's territories required the development of administrative mechanisms that could operate effectively across diverse geographical and cultural regions. Royal officials appointed to oversee different districts possessed authority to hear legal cases and collect royal revenues, while remaining accountable to the central court for their actions. Archaeological evidence suggests that these officials maintained residences at strategic locations throughout the kingdom, with excavated sites revealing buildings that combined residential accommodation with facilities for conducting official business and storing records. The military innovations that enabled Dyfed's territorial expansion included the adoption of new weapons technologies and tactical formations that improved the effectiveness of traditional Welsh warfare. The discovery of specialised spear points and sword blades at royal sites indicates the production of superior weapons using advanced metallurgical techniques, while horse equipment reveals the development of cavalry units that provided greater mobility and striking power than traditional infantry formations. These military improvements required substantial investments in training and equipment that reflected the kingdom's growing wealth and administrative sophistication. The fortification of strategic positions throughout the kingdom created defensive networks that protected vital trade routes and administrative centres, while providing secure bases for military operations. Archaeological investigation of these fortifications reveals sophisticated defensive designs that incorporated natural topographical advantages with constructed earthworks and stone walls, creating strongholds capable of withstanding prolonged sieges. The positioning of these fortifications suggests careful strategic planning that anticipated potential threats from multiple directions while maintaining communication links between different defensive positions. The prosperity that had characterised Dyfed under Rain ap Cadogan and his immediate successors faced its gravest challenge when Viking longships first appeared off the Welsh coast in the mid-9th century. These Norse raiders, having established bases in Ireland and the Isle of Man, recognised the wealth accumulated in Welsh monasteries and royal centres as irresistible targets for their systematic campaigns of plunder and territorial acquisition. Unlike the sporadic Irish raids that had occasionally troubled earlier generations, Viking attacks demonstrated unprecedented coordination and persistence, employing superior naval technology and battle-tested tactics that overwhelmed traditional Welsh coastal defences. The first documented Viking assault on Dyfed occurred in 853 AD when a fleet of approximately 40 ships struck the monastery at St David's during the summer sailing season. The raiders approached under cover of pre-dawn darkness, their shallow draft vessels enabling them to navigate close to shore before launching surprise attacks that caught the monastic community completely unprepared. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layers reveals the systematic nature of the assault, with burned buildings containing scattered metalwork and manuscript fragments that indicate thorough looting of the monastery's accumulated treasures. The attackers demonstrated particular interest in precious metals, stripping lead from roof installations and removing bronze fittings from doors and windows in addition to seizing portable wealth stored in the abbey treasury. The immediate aftermath of this attack revealed critical weaknesses in Dyfed's defensive arrangements that had evolved during centuries of relative security. The coastal monasteries, positioned to facilitate maritime communication with Ireland and continental Europe, possessed minimal fortifications designed primarily to mark territorial boundaries rather than withstand military assault. St. David's itself occupied a naturally defensible position within its valley depression, but the community had never developed the earthwork, fortifications, or military capabilities necessary to repel determined attackers equipped with superior weapons and tactical experience gained through campaigns across the Irish Sea. King Rodri ap Murphin of Gwyned's successful resistance to Viking attacks in northern Wales during the 850s provided both inspiration and practical guidance for Dyfed's defensive preparations. Rodri's forces had achieved notable victories through coordinated responses that combined rapid mobilization of local militias with strategic positioning of royal warbands at key defensive positions. His tactics emphasized mobility over static defense, using knowledge of local terrain to ambush Viking raiding parties while avoiding pitched battles against superior numbers. These innovations required substantial modifications to traditional Welsh military organisation, including the development of communication networks capable of rapidly alerting scattered communities to approaching threats. The response developed by Dyfed's rulers during the 860s involved systematic fortification of major monasteries and royal centres, combined with the establishment of coastal watch stations that could provide early warning of approaching Viking fleets. The reconstruction of St. David's included substantial earthwork defences surrounding the monastic enclosure, with archaeological evidence revealing timber palisades backed by earth ramparts capable of withstanding initial assault while providing time for relief forces to arrive. Similar defensive improvements appeared at other major ecclesiastical centres throughout the kingdom, transforming peaceful monastic communities into fortified strongholds that could shelter surrounding populations during Viking raids. The economic disruption caused by repeated Viking attacks fundamentally altered trade patterns and settlement distributions throughout Dyfed during the later 9th century. Coastal communities that had previously thrived on maritime commerce abandoned exposed positions in favour of inland locations that offered greater security from seaborne assault. Archaeological evidence from abandoned coastal settlements reveals hasty departures marked by buried hoards of valuables and unfinished construction projects, suggesting that populations relocated with minimal advance planning when Viking pressure became unbearable. The redistribution of population toward inland valleys created new demographic concentrations that required different administrative arrangements and altered traditional relationships between royal centres and their dependent territories. The Viking establishment of permanent bases at Dublin and other Irish ports created sustained pressure that differed qualitatively from earlier raiding patterns. These bases enabled Viking forces to maintain year-round presence in Irish seawaters, launching attacks during favourable weather conditions while withdrawing to secure harbours when storms or military resistance made operations impractical. The proximity of these bases to Welsh coasts meant that Viking raiders could strike with minimal advance warning, appearing suddenly off familiar harbours before coastal communities could organise effective resistance or evacuate valuable possessions to secure inland locations. The adaptation strategies developed by Welsh communities during this period demonstrate remarkable ingenuity in balancing security requirements with economic necessities. Coastal settlements developed sophisticated early warning systems using beacon fires positioned on prominent headlands, creating communication networks that could alert inland populations to approaching threats within hours of initial sightings. These beacon stations, staffed by rotating watches drawn from local communities, maintained constant vigilance during sailing seasons, while coordinating with mounted messengers who could carry detailed information about fleet sizes and probable destinations to royal centres and major monasteries. The monastery at St David's pioneered defensive innovations that influenced fortification design throughout Wales during the Viking period. The community's reconstruction efforts included the construction of a massive stone tower that served simultaneously as bell tower, library, and last refuge during attacks. This tower, built using sophisticated masonry techniques that combined Roman engineering principles with contemporary defensive requirements, featured walls over 2 meters thick with minimal external openings that could be sealed during sieges. Internal arrangements included storage spaces for food and water supplies, enabling the community to withstand prolonged blockades while maintaining essential religious functions. The development of these defensive technologies required substantial investments in skilled craftsmen and specialized materials that strained royal resources during a period when Viking raids simultaneously reduced tax revenues and increased military expenditures. The quarrying and transport of building stone for fortification projects demanded coordinated labour efforts that drew workers away from agricultural activities during critical seasons, creating food shortages that compounded the economic disruption caused by direct Viking attacks. Royal officials responsible for organising these construction projects faced the challenging task of balancing immediate defensive needs against long-term economic sustainability. The political implications of sustained Viking pressure gradually undermined the independence that Dyfed had maintained since the post-Roman period. The kingdom's rulers, facing military challenges that exceeded their individual capacity for resistance, increasingly sought alliances with more powerful neighbours who possessed greater military resources and territorial depth. These diplomatic initiatives required significant concessions that gradually reduced Dyfed's autonomy while providing access to military support necessary for survival against Viking threats. The marriage alliances and tribute arrangements that resulted from these negotiations created precedents for external intervention in Dyfed's internal affairs that would prove difficult to reverse once Viking pressure diminished. The extinction of Dyfed's main royal dynasty occurred around 950 AD through a combination of military casualties, political pressures, and demographic factors that had accumulated over several generations of Viking warfare. The direct male line descended from Sicil ap Clydog ended with the death of Lewach ap Hyfed, whose reign had been marked by continuous defensive campaigns that exhausted both royal resources and the kingdom's military capacity. Archaeological evidence from royal centres during this period reveals significant contraction in building activities and reduction in luxury goods, indicating economic decline that undermined the material foundations of royal authority. The incorporation of Dyfed into the expanding realm of Deheubarth under Hywel Dda represented both political necessity and strategic opportunity that transformed the region's relationship to broader Welsh political developments. Hywel's grandfather Cadelap Rhodri had established control over much of southern Wales through systematic campaigns that combined military conquest with diplomatic negotiation, creating a unified kingdom capable of resisting both Viking raids and expansion by neighbouring Welsh rulers. The absorption of Dyfed provided Deheubarth with access to valuable coastal territories and established harbours while eliminating a potential source of political fragmentation in southwestern Wales. Hywel Dda's administration of the former Dyfed territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of regional differences and local traditions that required careful accommodation within broader governmental structures. Rather than imposing uniform administrative arrangements throughout his expanded kingdom, Hywel maintained existing local officials and customary practices while introducing standardized legal codes and taxation systems that created coherence without destroying established relationships. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres reveals continuity in local governance combined with new standardised weights and measures that facilitated trade and taxation across territorial boundaries. The legal innovations associated with Hywel Dda's reign included systematic compilation of Welsh customary law into written codes that preserve traditional practices while creating frameworks for resolving disputes across different regions. The laws attributed to Hywel, though surviving only in later manuscripts, reflect sophisticated understanding of regional variations in custom and the practical requirements of governing diverse populations. These legal codes addressed everything from property rights and inheritance procedures to compensation for crimes and obligations of military service, creating comprehensive frameworks that remained influential throughout the medieval period. The economic integration of former Dyfed territories into Deheubarth involved standardization of coinage, weights, and measures that facilitated trade, while generating increased royal revenues through more efficient tax collection. Archaeological evidence reveals the introduction of new coin types during Hywel's reign, with silver pennies bearing Welsh inscriptions that asserted royal authority while demonstrating the kingdom's participation in broader European monetary systems. The discovery of these coins at sites throughout former Dyfed territory indicates successful implementation of standardized currency systems that enhance commercial activity while strengthening royal control over economic transactions. The military reorganization that accompanied political integration created more effective defensive systems capable of coordinating responses across larger territorial areas. The establishment of regional military commands under appointed officials responsible to the royal court enabled rapid mobilization of forces when Viking raids threatened coastal areas, while standardized equipment and training procedures improved the effectiveness of local militias. Archaeological evidence from fortified positions reveals systematic upgrading of defensive installations using techniques that combined traditional earthwork construction with stone masonry innovations learned from Viking fortification designs. The internal dynastic struggles that plagued Deheubarth following Hywel Dda's death in 950 AD created opportunities for external intervention that gradually undermined the kingdom's territorial integrity. The succession disputes between Hywel's sons and grandsons produced prolonged conflicts that exhausted royal resources while creating precedents for appeal to foreign allies during domestic political crises. These civil wars provided opportunities for ambitious nobles to advance their own interests through strategic alliances with competing claimants, creating factionalism that persisted long after immediate succession questions were resolved. The gradual infiltration of Norman adventurers into the Welsh borderlands during the late 11th century introduced new military technologies and political concepts that challenged traditional Welsh governance systems. These Norman settlers, initially arriving as individual adventurers seeking opportunities for advancement, gradually established territorial footholds through marriage alliances with Welsh noble families and military service with competing Welsh rulers. Their presence introduced continental European military techniques, including heavy cavalry warfare and sophisticated siege engineering that provided significant advantages in territorial conflicts. The construction of the first stone castles in the Welsh borderlands represented a revolutionary development in military architecture that fundamentally altered the strategic balance between Welsh kingdoms and their English neighbours. Unlike traditional Welsh fortifications that relied primarily on earthwork defences and timber palisades, these stone castles provided permanent strongholds capable of withstanding prolonged sieges while serving as bases for territorial expansion. The technical expertise required for castle construction necessitated importing skilled masons and engineers from continental Europe, creating cultural exchange that extended far beyond military applications. The introduction of mounted warfare techniques by Norman settlers challenged traditional Welsh military practices that had emphasised infantry combat supported by limited cavalry forces. The development of heavy cavalry units required substantial investments in specialised equipment, including mail armour, trained war horses, and the complex support systems necessary for maintaining mounted forces in campaign conditions. Archaeological evidence from elite sites reveals the gradual adoption of Norman military equipment alongside traditional Welsh weapons, indicating cultural adaptation that preserved indigenous military traditions while incorporating foreign innovations. The establishment of Norman lordships in the borderlands created new forms of territorial organisation that differed fundamentally from traditional Welsh political structures. These lordships operated according to feudal principles that emphasised personal relationships between lords and vassals, rather than the kinship-based obligations that had characterised Welsh society. The introduction of these alternative organisational models provided options for Welsh nobles seeking to enhance their own power, while creating precedents for territorial arrangements that would influence Welsh political development throughout the medieval period. The technological innovations introduced during this period extended beyond military applications to encompass agricultural improvements and craft production techniques that enhanced economic productivity. The introduction of improved plough designs and crop rotation systems increased agricultural yields while reducing labour requirements, creating surplus production that supported larger populations and more specialised economic activities. Archaeological evidence reveals significant expansion in craft production during the late 11th century, with new workshop sites producing goods using techniques that combine traditional Welsh methods with innovations learned from Norman and continental European craftsmen. The cultural exchanges that resulted from increased contact with Norman settlers and continental European influences created new forms of artistic expression that combined Welsh traditions with foreign stylistic elements. Manuscript illumination produced in Welsh scriptoriums during this period demonstrates sophisticated synthesis of Celtic decorative motifs with Romanesque artistic conventions, creating distinctive hybrid forms that influenced artistic development throughout Wales. Metalworking traditions similarly evolved to incorporate new techniques and decorative schemes, while preserving the technical expertise that had characterised Welsh craftsmanship for centuries. The systematic Norman conquest of former Dyfed territories began in earnest following the death of Rhys ap Tewdwr in 1093 AD, when his defeat at Brecon eliminated the last effective resistance to Anglo-Norman expansion into south-western Wales. Within months of this decisive battle, Norman adventurers who had been probing Welsh defences for decades launched coordinated campaigns that would fundamentally transform the political, social, and economic landscape of the region. The speed and thoroughness of this conquest reflected not opportunistic raiding, but carefully planned territorial acquisition, employing military innovations and administrative techniques that the fragmented Welsh kingdoms proved unable to counter effectively. Arnulf de Montgomery, younger son of Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, spearheaded the initial Norman advance into Dyfed from his base at Pembroke. His forces, comprising approximately 300 mounted knights supported by several thousand infantry, drawn from the Welsh borders and Normandy, represented a military machine qualitatively superior to anything the Welsh could field. The Norman heavy cavalry, equipped with mail hauberks, kite shields, and 11-foot lances, possessed devastating shock power when deployed against traditional Welsh infantry formations, while their disciplined tactical formations enabled them to maintain cohesion during the fluid battlefield conditions that characterised Welsh warfare. The construction of Pembroke Castle commenced immediately following Arnulf's initial success, with Norman engineers selecting a naturally defensible limestone promontory overlooking the Pembroke River. The site's position commanded both the river crossing and approaches from multiple directions, while remaining accessible to supply ships from Bristol and the Norman strongholds in Ireland. Archaeological evidence reveals that construction began with a substantial timber palisade surrounding a central motte, providing immediate defensive capability while permanent stone fortifications were planned and executed. The speed of this construction, completed within 18 months, demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that enabled Norman forces to consolidate territorial gains rapidly while maintaining offensive pressure against remaining Welsh strongholds. The strategic positioning of Pembroke Castle reflected Norman understanding of territorial control that differed fundamentally from traditional Welsh approaches to fortification. Rather than occupying hilltop positions that provided defensive advantages but limited territorial influence, the Normans positioned their castles to control river crossings, harbour approaches, and major roadways that channeled movement throughout the region. This approach enabled relatively small garrison forces to dominate extensive territories by controlling the infrastructure necessary for trade, communication, and military movement. The psychological impact of these imposing stone structures, visible for miles across the surrounding countryside, reinforced Norman authority while demonstrating the permanence of their territorial claims. The arrival of Gerald de Windsor as Castellan of Pembroke around 1100 AD marked a crucial transition from military conquest to systematic colonisation that would reshape the demographic and cultural character of southwestern Wales. Gerald, a veteran administrator with extensive experience in the Welsh borderlands, possessed both the military expertise necessary for frontier defence and the administrative skills required for establishing functional governmental structures. His marriage to Nestfersh Rhys, daughter of the last king of Deheubarth, represented a calculated political alliance that provided legitimacy among Welsh populations while creating kinship connections that complicated potential resistance movements. The establishment of the Lordship of Pembroke under Gerald's administration created new forms of territorial organisation that combined Norman feudal principles with practical adaptations to Welsh conditions. Unlike the standardised administrative arrangements employed in lowland England, the Pembroke lordship incorporated existing Welsh territorial divisions, while introducing Norman legal frameworks and military obligations. The cantref system that had organised Welsh territory for centuries continued functioning under Norman oversight, with Welsh nobles who accepted Norman authority retaining local administrative responsibilities while acknowledging feudal obligations to their Norman overlords. The de Clare family's acquisition of extensive territories in former Ceredigion during the early 12th century demonstrated the systematic nature of Norman territorial expansion throughout the region. Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow before his involvement in the Irish conquest, established his authority through a combination of military pressure and strategic marriages that created claims to Welsh territories through inheritance rights. His construction of castles at Cardigan and other strategic positions created a network of fortified bases that controlled river valleys and coastal approaches while providing secure refuges for Norman settlers and their Welsh allies. The architectural innovations introduced by Norman castle builders revolutionised defensive capabilities while creating new forms of social organisation centred on these fortified complexes. The Great Tower, or keep that dominated most Norman castles, served multiple functions as residential quarters for the lord's household, administrative centre for territorial governance, and ultimate refuge during siege conditions. These massive stone structures, typically rising 4 or 5 stories above ground level, required sophisticated engineering techniques that combined military functionality with residential comfort. The walls, often exceeding 3 meters in thickness, incorporated defensive features including arrow loops, murder holes, and spiral staircases designed to favour defenders during internal combat. The introduction of concentric fortification designs during the later 12th century reflected evolving military technologies and the accumulated experience of castle warfare throughout the Norman territories. These sophisticated defensive systems featured multiple rings of walls and towers that created successive lines of defence, enabling garrisons to conduct fighting withdrawals while maintaining secure positions. The outer bailies provided protected spaces for livestock, workshops and additional troops, while the inner ward contained the essential facilities necessary for prolonged resistance. Archaeological investigation of these sites reveals the complexity of their internal arrangements, with specialised buildings for different functions, including armouries, granaries, chapels, and residential quarters for various social levels within the castle community. The Fitzgerald family's establishment of their lordship centred on Haverfordwest represented another crucial component of Norman territorial control throughout former Dyfed. Their castle, positioned on a commanding ridge overlooking the western Cleddau River, controlled access to the excellent natural harbour of Milford Haven, while dominating the fertile agricultural lands of the surrounding valleys. The town that developed beneath the castle walls followed Norman urban planning principles with a regular street pattern radiating from the market square, creating commercial spaces that attracted merchants and craftsmen from throughout the Norman territories and beyond. The systematic introduction of feudal land tenure throughout the conquered territories created new relationships between lords and peasants that differed fundamentally from traditional Welsh social organisation. Norman lords granted landholdings to their followers in exchange for military service obligations that could be called upon during campaigns or defensive emergencies. These grants, formalised through written charters that specified exact obligations and territorial boundaries, created permanent records of landholding arrangements that provided legal security for Norman settlers while establishing clear chains of authority extending from individual peasant holdings to the great lordships that dominated regional politics. The agricultural innovations introduced by Norman and Flemish settlers significantly increased agricultural productivity while transforming settlement patterns throughout the conquered territories. The heavy ploughs employed by these settlers could work the heavy clay soils that had previously remained largely uncultivated, opening new agricultural lands that supported larger populations and more intensive farming practices. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the introduction of new crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while producing higher yields, enabling agricultural surpluses that supported the growing urban populations and provided tax revenues for territorial administration. The establishment of planned towns throughout former Dyfed represented a conscious strategy for creating commercial centres that would attract settlers while generating revenues for Norman lords. Haverfordwest, Tenby and Pembroke developed according to standardised urban plans that allocated specific areas for different economic activities while maintaining defensive capabilities that could protect urban populations during military emergencies. These towns received formal charters that granted trading privileges and legal protections designed to attract merchants and craftsmen, creating economic opportunities that drew settlers from England, Normandy, and Flanders seeking advancement in the expanding Norman territories. The Flemish colonisation programme initiated during the early 12th century brought substantial numbers of experienced farmers and craftsmen to the region under formal agreements that provided land grants in exchange for settlement obligations. These Flemish settlers, recruited from the overcrowded lowlands of modern Belgium and the Netherlands, possessed agricultural expertise particularly suited to the coastal regions of southwestern Wales. Their knowledge of drainage techniques, crop selection and livestock management proved invaluable for developing the agricultural potential of lands that had previously supported only pastoral activities or remained completely uncultivated. Archaeological evidence from Flemish settlement areas reveals distinctive material culture that preserved continental European traditions while adapting to local conditions and resources. Pottery production in these communities employed techniques and decorative schemes that differed markedly from both Norman and Welsh traditions, creating distinctive ceramic assemblages that enable identification of Flemish settlement sites. House construction followed continental patterns with stone foundations supporting timber superstructures. while agricultural tools and techniques reflected innovations developed in the intensive farming regions of Flanders and northern France. The linguistic impact of Norman and Flemish settlement created complex multilingual communities where Norman French, Flemish, Welsh, and Latin served different functions within emerging social hierarchies. Norman French became the language of administration and high culture, employed in legal documents and formal ceremonies that reinforced Norman political authority. Welsh remained the primary language for most rural populations, particularly in areas where Norman settlement remained limited, while Latin continued serving ecclesiastical and scholarly functions. The Flemish settlers maintained their own linguistic traditions within their communities, while gradually adopting Norman French for external communications and official business. The transformation of ecclesiastical organisation under Norman rule involved systematic replacement of Welsh clerical hierarchies with Norman appointees, while preserving certain aspects of traditional Welsh religious practices that proved compatible with continental European Christianity. The appointment of Bernard as Bishop of St David's in 1115 AD marked the beginning of efforts to align Welsh ecclesiastical structures with Norman administrative requirements and papal authority. Bernard's reforms included the introduction of continental European monastic rules, standardization of liturgical practices, and establishment of closer ties with ecclesiastical centres in Normandy and England. The architectural transformation of religious buildings reflected both Norman ecclesiastical preferences and the practical requirements of administering territories with mixed populations. The reconstruction of St David's Cathedral during the late 12th century employed Norman Romanesque architectural principles while incorporating certain Welsh decorative elements that maintained connections to traditional religious practices. The massive stone construction, featuring rounded arches, thick walls, and minimal external decoration, created imposing structures that demonstrated Norman power while providing secure locations for storing ecclesiastical treasures and conducting religious ceremonies. The survival of Welsh law and custom in certain areas represented both practical necessity and calculated policy that enabled Norman lords to govern diverse populations without creating unnecessary resistance. The legal system that emerged combined Norman feudal law with Welsh customary practices, creating hybrid arrangements that varied significantly between different lordships and territorial divisions. Welsh nobles who accepted Norman authority often retained jurisdiction over their traditional followers, administering justice according to Welsh legal traditions, while acknowledging Norman overlordship and accepting certain feudal obligations. The preservation of Welsh inheritance customs proved particularly important for maintaining social stability during the transition to Norman rule. The Welsh practice of partible inheritance, which divided property among all male heirs rather than concentrating it in the eldest son, continued operating within Norman legal frameworks that recognised these arrangements as valid local customs. This accommodation enabled Welsh noble families to maintain their social positions while accepting Norman political authority, creating collaborative relationships that facilitated territorial administration without requiring complete cultural assimilation. The development of marcher lordships throughout the region created autonomous jurisdictions that operated according to their own legal traditions, while acknowledging royal authority in matters of military service and major political decisions. These lordships possessed extensive judicial powers, including the right to impose capital punishment, wage private warfare, and establish their own administrative arrangements without external interference. Archaeological evidence from lordship centres reveals the development of sophisticated governmental institutions, including permanent courts, record-keeping systems, and specialised administrative buildings that supported complex territorial management. The economic integration of conquered territories into Norman commercial networks created new trading relationships that connected southwestern Wales to markets throughout the Norman Empire and beyond. The harbours at Milford Haven and other coastal locations became important ports for trade with Ireland, where Norman expansion created demand for Welsh agricultural products and raw materials. Archaeological evidence from these ports reveals increased quantities of imported goods, including wine from Gascony, pottery from northern France, and luxury textiles that demonstrated the growing prosperity of Norman settlers and their Welsh collaborators. The introduction of new monetary systems facilitated commercial development while providing Norman lords with standardised methods for collecting taxes and rents from their territorial holdings. The minting of silver pennies at various lordship centres created local currencies that enabled more sophisticated commercial transactions while maintaining connections to broader European monetary systems. Archaeological finds of these coins throughout the region indicate successful implementation of monetary economies that gradually replaced the barter systems that had characterised much of pre-Norman Welsh commerce. The technological innovations introduced by Norman settlers extended beyond military applications to encompass improvements in agricultural tools, construction techniques, and craft production methods that enhanced economic productivity throughout the region. The introduction of windmills and improved watermills increased grain processing capacity while reducing labour requirements, creating agricultural surpluses that supported growing urban populations. Archaeological evidence from mill sites reveals sophisticated engineering that combined Norman technical knowledge with adaptations to local geographical conditions and resource availability. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Norman conquest created distinctive regional traditions that combined elements from Welsh, Norman, Flemish, and broader European sources while developing characteristics specific to the transformed territories of former Dyfed. Manuscript illumination produced in the region during the late 12th century demonstrates sophisticated artistic traditions that incorporated Celtic decorative motifs with Norman stylistic elements, creating works of exceptional beauty that influenced artistic development throughout Wales and the Norman territories. Metalworking traditions similarly evolved to serve both Norman and Welsh markets, while preserving technical expertise that had characterised regional craftsmanship for centuries. The consolidation of Norman territorial control throughout former Dyfed by 1200 AD created the foundation for a complex system of marcher lordships that would dominate the region's political landscape for the next 2 centuries. These autonomous jurisdictions operated according to distinctive legal and administrative frameworks that combined Norman feudal principles with practical adaptations to Welsh conditions, creating hybrid governmental structures that differed significantly from both the standardised administrative arrangements of lowland England and the traditional kinship-based authority systems of independent Welsh kingdoms. The marcher lords who governed these territories possessed extraordinary powers that included the right to wage private warfare, establish their own legal codes, and mint currency, effectively functioning as sovereign rulers within their territorial boundaries while maintaining nominal allegiance to the English crown. The lordship of Pembroke under William Marshal demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that characterised successful marcher governance during the early 13th century. Marshal, who had acquired the lordship through marriage to Isabel de Clare in 1189, possessed extensive experience in continental European politics and military affairs that enabled him to implement governmental innovations throughout his Welsh territories. His administrative reforms included the establishment of permanent record-keeping systems that documented land grants, legal proceedings, and financial transactions, creating institutional continuity that survived changes in lordship while providing legal frameworks for resolving disputes between Norman settlers and Welsh populations. The chancery rolls maintained at Pembroke Castle reveal the complexity of territorial administration that characterised marcher lordships during this period. These documents, written in Norman, French and Latin, recorded everything from major land grants to minor legal disputes, creating comprehensive archives that enabled efficient governance across territories that encompass diverse geographical regions and cultural communities. The scribes responsible for maintaining these records possessed sophisticated legal training that enabled them to navigate the complex jurisdictional arrangements that governed relationships between different lordships, ecclesiastical institutions, and royal administrative structures. The development of the March of Wales as a distinct political entity reflected the practical impossibility of imposing uniform administrative arrangements across the culturally diverse territories of medieval Wales. The Marcher lordships that emerged during the 12th and 13th centuries operated according to the principle of autonomous jurisdiction, with each lord possessing sovereign authority within his territorial boundaries while acknowledging certain obligations to the English crown. This system created a complex patchwork of jurisdictions where legal procedures, taxation systems, and military obligations varied significantly between neighbouring territories, requiring sophisticated diplomatic skills to maintain peaceful relationships and coordinate responses to external threats. The integration of former Dyfed territories into this Marcher system involved careful accommodation of existing Welsh territorial divisions and legal traditions that had governed local communities for centuries. The Contref and Comote boundaries that had organised Welsh administration since the early medieval period continued functioning under Norman oversight, with Welsh officials often retaining administrative responsibilities while accepting feudal obligations to their Norman overlords. This preservation of familiar administrative structures facilitated the transition to Norman rule, while maintaining social stability that enabled economic development and cultural exchange. The linguistic landscape of the region during this period reflected the complex cultural interactions that characterised Marcher society. Norman French served as the primary language of administration and high culture, employed in legal documents, ceremonial occasions, and formal communications between lordships. Welsh remained the dominant language for most rural populations, particularly in areas where Norman settlement remained limited to strategic strongholds and administrative centres. The introduction of English-speaking settlers from the borderlands created additional linguistic complexity, while Latin continued serving ecclesiastical and scholarly functions throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from urban centres reveals the gradual adoption of Norman French terminology for commercial and legal activities, with Welsh craftsmen and merchants acquiring sufficient French vocabulary to conduct business with Norman settlers and administrators. Inscriptions on pottery and metalwork from this period demonstrate the bilingual capabilities that characterised many inhabitants of Marcher territories, while legal documents reveal the development of standardised translation procedures that enabled Welsh legal traditions to function within Norman administrative frameworks. The preservation of Welsh place names throughout the region indicates the persistence of Welsh cultural identity despite the political dominance of Norman institutions. The economic transformation that accompanied Marcher lordship development created new commercial opportunities that connected southwestern Wales to expanding European trade networks. The harbours at Milford Haven, Tenby, and other coastal locations became important entrepôts for trade with Ireland, where Norman expansion had created demand for Welsh agricultural products, livestock and raw materials. Archaeological evidence from these ports reveals increased quantities of imported goods, including wine from Gascony, pottery from northern France, and luxury textiles that demonstrated the growing prosperity of both Norman settlers and their Welsh trading partners. The development of the wool trade during the 13th century created the most significant economic transformation in the region since the Norman conquest. The extensive upland pastures that had traditionally supported Welsh cattle herds proved ideally suited for sheep farming, while Norman agricultural innovations enabled more intensive land use that supported larger flocks. The Cistercian monasteries that had been established throughout the region during the 12th century became major wool producers, developing sophisticated flock management techniques that maximised wool quality while maintaining sustainable grazing practices across their extensive territorial holdings. Tintern Abbey, though located outside the core former Dyfed territories, exemplified the agricultural innovations that transformed rural economies throughout the Marcher lordships. The monastery's sheep farms employed systematic breeding programs that improved wool quality while increasing flock sizes, creating agricultural surpluses that generated substantial revenues for monastic building projects and charitable activities. Archaeological evidence from similar monastic establishments throughout southwestern Wales reveals the adoption of these intensive farming techniques, with new barn constructions and wool processing facilities that supported expanding commercial operations. The integration of Welsh wool production into European commercial networks required sophisticated marketing arrangements that connected local producers to international merchants operating from London, Bristol, and continental European trading centres. Italian merchant houses established permanent representatives in Welsh market towns, providing credit arrangements and transportation services that enabled local producers to access distant markets while assuming the risks associated with long-distance commerce. Archaeological evidence from market towns reveals the construction of specialised buildings for wool storage and processing, with stone warehouses and timber-framed halls that accommodated the seasonal rhythms of wool production and marketing. The growth of market towns throughout the region reflected the increasing commercialisation of rural economies that accompanied the expansion of wool production and other agricultural innovations. Haverfordwest emerged as the most important commercial centre in former Dyfed, with its strategic position controlling access to Milford Haven, enabling merchants to coordinate trade between Wales, Ireland, and continental Europe. The town's market charter, granted by the Lord of Pembroke, established regular market days and annual fairs that attracted traders from throughout Wales and beyond, creating commercial opportunities that supported growing populations of craftsmen and service providers. The urban planning principles employed in these market towns combined Norman administrative requirements with practical considerations related to defence and commerce. The typical layout featured a central market square surrounded by plots allocated for different trades, with specialised areas for cloth merchants, metal workers, food vendors, and livestock dealers. Archaeological excavations in Haverfordwest have revealed the systematic development of these commercial districts, with standardised plot sizes and building requirements that created uniform streetscapes while maintaining flexibility for different commercial activities. The introduction of new craft production techniques during this period created distinctive regional industries that served both local markets and export trade. Pottery production evolved to incorporate Norman technical innovations while preserving certain Welsh decorative traditions, creating hybrid ceramic styles that appealed to diverse consumer preferences. The kilns discovered at various sites throughout the region reveal sophisticated firing techniques that enabled production of high-quality glazed wares suitable for wealthy households, while maintaining capacity for producing everyday vessels for local consumption. Metalworking traditions adapted to serve the expanding commercial economy while preserving the technical expertise that had characterised Welsh craftsmanship for centuries. Archaeological evidence from smithies in market towns reveals the production of specialised tools for wool processing, including shears, combs, and processing equipment that reflected the growing importance of textile production. The discovery of lead seals used for marking wool bales indicates participation in standardised quality control systems that enabled Welsh wool to compete effectively in international markets. The religious transformation that accompanied Marcher lordship development involved systematic efforts to align Welsh ecclesiastical structures with continental European practices, while preserving certain aspects of traditional Welsh Christianity that remained compatible with reformed religious observances. The establishment of new monastic foundations during the 12th and 13th centuries introduced continental European religious orders that brought innovative agricultural techniques and scholarly traditions to the region. The Cistercians, Augustinians, and other reformed orders established monasteries that became centres of learning and economic development while maintaining connections to international networks of religious houses. Strata Florida Abbey, positioned strategically in the Teifi Valley, exemplified the role of reformed monasteries in preserving Welsh cultural traditions while introducing continental European religious practices. The community's scriptorium produced manuscripts that combined Welsh historical traditions with continental European theological works, creating distinctive literary forms that influenced cultural development throughout Wales. Archaeological evidence from the abbey reveals sophisticated building techniques that incorporated both Norman architectural principles and adaptations to local climate and materials, creating structures that serve practical monastic requirements while demonstrating impressive artistic achievements. The preservation of Welsh saints' cults within reformed religious frameworks required careful negotiation between traditional devotional practices and continental European theological standards. The Shrine of St. David at the cathedral that bore his name continued attracting pilgrims from throughout the Celtic world, generating revenues that supported ambitious building projects while maintaining the saint's reputation for miraculous interventions. The cathedral's reconstruction during the late 12th and early 13th centuries employed Norman architectural techniques while incorporating decorative elements that preserved connections to traditional Welsh religious art. The development of pilgrimage routes connecting Welsh religious sites to major European pilgrimage destinations created cultural exchanges that enriched regional religious traditions while providing economic benefits to communities along these routes. Archaeological evidence from hospices and religious houses reveals the infrastructure that supported pilgrimage traffic, with specialised buildings for accommodating travellers and facilities for caring for the sick and injured. These institutions served both religious and commercial functions, providing services that generated revenues while fulfilling charitable obligations that enhanced their spiritual reputations. The legal synthesis that emerged within Marcher lordships created distinctive jurisdictional arrangements that combined Norman feudal law with Welsh customary practices in ways that varied significantly between different territories and social groups. The survival of Welsh law codes alongside Norman legal procedures created complex situations where the same dispute might be adjudicated according to different legal traditions, depending on the social status of the participants and the nature of the issues involved. Archaeological evidence from court sites reveals the physical arrangements that accommodated these parallel legal systems, with separate meeting spaces for different types of proceedings and specialised facilities for storing legal documents and records. The preservation of Welsh inheritance customs proved particularly important for maintaining social stability during the transition to Marcher lordship. The Welsh practice of partable inheritance continued operating within Norman legal frameworks, enabling Welsh noble families to maintain their social positions while accepting political subordination to Norman overlords. Legal documents from this period reveal the complex negotiations required to reconcile Welsh inheritance practices with Norman feudal obligations, creating hybrid arrangements that satisfied both legal traditions while providing practical solutions to succession disputes. The development of administrative institutions within Marcher lordships required sophisticated personnel capable of navigating the complex legal and cultural landscape that characterised these territories. The chancery staffs employed by major lords included Welsh-speaking clerks who could communicate with local populations while maintaining the Latin and Norman French documentation required for external communications. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres reveals the specialised buildings and equipment necessary for maintaining these complex bureaucratic operations, with scriptoriums, archives and meeting halls that supported the diverse functions of territorial governance. The military obligations that characterised Marcher lordship created distinctive forms of service that combined Norman feudal requirements with adaptations to Welsh military traditions and geographical conditions. The castle guard duties required from feudal tenants involved regular service at lordship strongholds, while military expeditions required coordination between Norman heavy cavalry, Welsh infantry, and specialised forces adapted to local terrain and tactical requirements. Archaeological evidence from castle sites reveals the facilities necessary for maintaining these diverse military forces, with specialised buildings for different types of troops and equipment storage areas that accommodated varied military technologies. The fortification innovations introduced during the 13th century reflected both evolving military technologies and the accumulated experience of castle warfare in Welsh conditions. The concentric castle designs employed at sites like Caerphilly demonstrated sophisticated defensive concepts that created multiple lines of resistance while providing secure bases for territorial control. Archaeological investigation of these sites reveals the complexity of their internal arrangements, with specialised facilities for different aspects of military and administrative functions that enabled effective governance of surrounding territories. The cultural fusion that characterised Marcher society during this period created distinctive artistic traditions that combined elements from Welsh, Norman, and broader European sources, while developing characteristics specific to the transformed social landscape. Manuscript illumination produced in monastic scriptoriums throughout the region demonstrates sophisticated synthesis of Celtic decorative motifs with continental European artistic conventions, creating works that served both religious and secular purposes while preserving traditional Welsh cultural knowledge. The patronage provided by Marcher lords and wealthy merchants supported these artistic activities while creating markets for luxury goods that demonstrated social status and cultural sophistication. The architectural developments that occurred during the 13th and 14th centuries reflected the increasing prosperity and cultural confidence of Marcher society while demonstrating the successful integration of diverse cultural traditions. The parish churches constructed during this period employed architectural techniques that combined Norman structural innovations with decorative elements derived from Welsh artistic traditions, creating distinctive regional styles that influenced ecclesiastical architecture throughout Wales. Archaeological evidence reveals the sophisticated planning and execution required for these building projects, with evidence of specialised craftsmen who possessed technical knowledge drawn from multiple cultural traditions. The outbreaks of the Glyndŵr rising in 1400 AD sent shockwaves through the established Marcher lordships that had dominated former Demetae territories for over 3 centuries. Owain Glyndwr's proclamation as Prince of Wales at Glyndifrdwy resonated powerfully throughout southwestern Wales, where memories of independent Welsh kingdoms remained embedded in local consciousness, despite generations of Norman and English rule. The initial response in former Dyfed varied dramatically between different communities and social groups, reflecting the complex cultural and political landscape that had evolved under Marcher lordship. In areas where Welsh cultural identity remained strong, particularly in the upland regions where Norman settlement had been limited, Glyndwr's call for Welsh independence attracted immediate support from minor nobles and common farmers who saw opportunity to overthrow foreign domination. The strategic importance of Pembrokeshire's harbours made the region a crucial battleground for control of communications with Ireland, where Glyndwr sought military support for his independence campaign. Archaeological evidence from coastal fortifications reveals hasty improvements to defensive installations during the early years of the Rising, with earthwork reinforcements added to existing castle defences and new watchtowers constructed at strategic points along the coastline. The English administration recognised that losing control of Milford Haven would enable Irish reinforcements to reach Welsh rebels while cutting vital supply lines that connected the Marcher lordships to royal resources in England and France. The siege of Haverfordwest in 1405 demonstrated both the military capabilities that Glyndwr's forces had developed and the limitations that ultimately constrained their territorial ambitions. The rebel army that invested the town comprised approximately 2,000 Welsh infantry supported by limited cavalry forces and siege equipment captured from earlier victories. Archaeological investigation of the siege lines reveals sophisticated earthwork positions that surrounded the town while maintaining communication links to the surrounding countryside. The attackers employed mining techniques against the town's stone walls, with excavated tunnels still visible beneath certain sections of the medieval fortifications, though the defenders successfully countered these efforts through timely detection and flooding of the underground workings. The response of local populations to Glyndwr's appeals revealed the complex loyalties that characterized Marcher society after centuries of cultural interaction. In areas where Norman settlement had created mixed communities, support for the Rising often divided along social and economic lines, rather than simple ethnic boundaries. Wealthy Welsh landowners who had prospered under English rule frequently remained loyal to the crown, while English-speaking farmers and craftsmen in some areas joined Welsh rebels seeking to overthrow oppressive taxation and administrative controls. The fragmentary nature of surviving records makes precise assessment difficult, but evidence suggests that economic grievances often proved more decisive than cultural identity in determining individual responses to the rebellion. The involvement of French military advisors with Glyndwr's forces introduced continental European siege techniques and tactical innovations that temporarily enhanced Welsh military capabilities. These advisors, dispatched as part of French efforts to destabilise English power during the ongoing 100 Years' War, brought expertise in artillery deployment and fortification assault that enabled Welsh forces to capture several previously impregnable strongholds. Archaeological evidence from castle sites reveals damage patterns consistent with early cannon fire, marking the first documented use of gunpowder weapons in Welsh warfare. The French advisors also introduced improved crossbow designs and standardized equipment that enhanced the effectiveness of Welsh infantry formations. The economic disruption caused by prolonged warfare fundamentally altered commercial patterns throughout the region, with traditional trade routes abandoned as merchants sought safer alternatives to transport goods between Wales and English markets. The wool trade that had generated substantial prosperity during the 13th and 14th centuries contracted dramatically as fighting made sheep farming impossible in contested areas while disrupting the transportation networks necessary for reaching international markets. Archaeological evidence from abandoned farmsteads reveals the systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure, with burned barns and slaughtered livestock indicating the deliberate economic warfare that characterized much of the conflict. The gradual suppression of the Rising after 1408 involved systematic campaigns that combined military pressure with economic incentives designed to detach moderate supporters from Glyndwr's cause. Prince Henry, later Henry V, employed tactics that emphasised restoration of normal commercial activities alongside punishment of active rebels, creating opportunities for former supporters to return to royal allegiance without facing complete confiscation of their properties. The pardons granted to Welsh nobles who submitted before specific deadlines preserved existing social hierarchies while demonstrating royal mercy that encouraged further defections from the rebel cause. The aftermath of Glyndwr's defeat created opportunities for English royal administration to implement systematic reforms that reduced the autonomy previously enjoyed by Marcher lords while strengthening direct royal control over Welsh territories. The Statute of 1401 had already imposed restrictions on Welsh land ownership and legal rights, but the suppression of the Rising enabled more comprehensive administrative changes that gradually undermined the jurisdictional independence that had characterised Marcher lordships since the Norman conquest. Royal officials appointed to oversee former rebel territories possessed enhanced powers that superseded traditional Marcher privileges, creating precedents for direct royal intervention that would prove crucial for later administrative unification. The reconstruction efforts that followed the Rising's suppression required substantial investments in infrastructure repair and economic revival that strained both royal resources and local communities. The systematic destruction of mills, bridges and market facilities during the warfare necessitated coordinated rebuilding programs that involved collaboration between royal officials, surviving marcher lords, and local communities. Archaeological evidence from reconstruction projects reveals the adoption of improved building techniques that incorporated lessons learned during the conflict, with stronger defensive features added to civilian structures and enhanced fire-resistant construction methods that reduced vulnerability to future military actions. The emergence of new gentry families during the post-Glyndŵr period reflected both the social disruption caused by the Rising and the opportunities created by royal efforts to establish reliable local administration. Many traditional Welsh noble families had suffered confiscation or execution for their support of the rebellion, creating vacancies in local leadership that royal officials filled through promotion of loyal administrators and grants of confiscated properties to English settlers. Archaeological evidence from newly established manor houses reveals the material prosperity that these emerging gentry families achieved through royal service, with sophisticated residential buildings that demonstrated their successful integration into English administrative structures. The gradual integration of marcher lordships under increasingly centralised royal control accelerated during the 15th century as the English crown systematically reduced the autonomous privileges that had characterised these territories since their Norman establishment. The financial pressures created by the 100 Years' War and domestic conflicts required more efficient revenue collection from Welsh territories, necessitating administrative standardisation that eliminated the jurisdictional complexities that had previously enabled marcher lords to maintain independent authority. Royal officials appointed to supervise marcher administration possessed enhanced powers that enabled them to override traditional privileges when these conflicted with royal interests or efficient governance. The establishment of royal administrative centres at strategic locations throughout former Dyfed created new focal points for territorial governance that gradually displaced the castle-centred authority structures that had characterised marcher lordships. These administrative centres, typically positioned in existing market towns rather than isolated fortified positions, reflected changing concepts of territorial control that emphasised commercial regulation and legal administration over military dominance. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals purpose-built structures for record-keeping, legal proceedings, and tax collection that provided the institutional infrastructure necessary for systematic royal administration. The introduction of standardised legal procedures throughout the region required careful navigation of the complex jurisdictional arrangements that had evolved under marcher lordship. Royal officials responsible for implementing these reforms faced the challenging task of reconciling English common law with Welsh customary practices and Norman feudal traditions that had operated simultaneously within different communities and social groups. The legal synthesis that emerged preserved certain local customs while establishing uniform procedures for major criminal cases and commercial disputes that affected royal revenues or involved parties from different jurisdictions. The social transformation that accompanied administrative centralisation involved the gradual emergence of a Welsh gentry class that combined traditional Welsh cultural identity with successful participation in English governmental and commercial systems. These families, often descended from pre-conquest Welsh nobility or Norman settlers who had adopted Welsh cultural practices, possessed the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary for mediating between royal administration and local populations. Their manor houses, constructed during the 15th century, employed architectural styles that combined English residential fashions with defensive features appropriate for frontier conditions. The cultural patronage provided by these gentry families supported the preservation and development of Welsh literary traditions, while demonstrating their successful integration into broader British cultural networks. The manuscript collections maintained at gentry residences included both Welsh genealogical texts that preserved traditional clan histories and English literary works that reflected contemporary cultural fashions. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals libraries that contained substantial collections of both religious and secular texts, indicating sophisticated literary interests that extended beyond the practical requirements of estate management and local administration. The development of Welsh poetry during this period reflected both the preservation of traditional bardic practices and adaptation to changing social conditions that required new forms of literary expression. The poets who served gentry households developed distinctive verse forms that combined traditional Welsh metrics with contemporary themes related to social advancement and political loyalty. These poems, performed during ceremonial occasions and recorded in manuscript collections, preserved genealogical information that connected contemporary families to ancient royal lineages while celebrating their achievements within English administrative and social systems. The genealogical traditions that linked contemporary Welsh families to the ancient rulers of Dyfn served crucial functions in maintaining cultural identity while legitimising social advancement within English political structures. The manuscript compilations produced during the 15th century systematically traced family connections back through the medieval kingdoms to the legendary founders of Welsh royal dynasties, creating comprehensive genealogical networks that demonstrated the continuity of Welsh noble lineages despite centuries of political transformation. These genealogical texts employed sophisticated historical methodology that combined oral traditions with documentary evidence from monastic chronicles and royal records. The preservation of these genealogical traditions required collaboration between professional poets, monastic scholars, and gentry patrons who possessed both the cultural knowledge and economic resources necessary for maintaining accurate records. The scriptoriums that produced these manuscripts employed specialized techniques for organizing complex genealogical information, with standardized symbols and abbreviations that enabled efficient recording of extensive family relationships. Archaeological evidence from manuscript production centers reveals the sophisticated equipment and materials required for these scholarly activities, including specialized writing implements and high-quality vellum that demonstrated the substantial investment required for preserving cultural knowledge. The economic changes that characterized the late medieval period created new opportunities for social advancement that enabled ambitious families to achieve gentry status through commercial success rather than traditional military service or administrative appointment. The expansion of cloth production during the 15th century generated substantial wealth for entrepreneurs who could organize textile manufacturing and marketing operations that served both domestic and export markets. Archaeological evidence from clothier residences reveals the material prosperity that successful textile merchants achieved, with elaborate residential buildings that rivaled the manor houses of traditional landed gentry. The development of new commercial relationships with English markets required Welsh producers to adapt their manufacturing techniques and product specifications to meet changing consumer preferences in urban centres throughout England. The cloth production that emerged in former Dyfed during this period employed improved weaving techniques and finishing processes that created textiles competitive with established English manufacturing centres. Archaeological evidence from textile workshops reveals sophisticated equipment, including improved looms and fulling mills that enable production of high-quality woolen cloth suitable for wealthy consumers. The integration of Welsh commercial activities into English economic networks facilitated cultural exchange that influenced artistic production and architectural development throughout the region. The merchant families who achieved prosperity through textile production and other commercial activities employed their wealth to construct elaborate residences that demonstrated their social advancement while maintaining connections to Welsh cultural traditions. These buildings employed architectural techniques that combined English residential fashions with Welsh decorative elements, creating distinctive regional styles that reflected successful cultural synthesis. The religious changes that accompanied political integration involved systematic efforts to align Welsh ecclesiastical practices with English religious traditions while preserving certain aspects of Welsh Christian heritage that remained compatible with Reformed observances. The appointment of English bishops to Welsh sees created administrative connections that facilitated religious standardisation, while providing opportunities for Welsh clergy to advance within broader ecclesiastical hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from religious buildings reveals architectural modifications that reflected changing liturgical practices while preserving certain traditional features that maintained connections to Welsh religious heritage. The educational developments that occurred during the late medieval period created new opportunities for Welsh students to acquire the learning necessary for advancement within English administrative and ecclesiastical systems. The grammar schools established in major towns provided instruction in Latin and English that enabled promising students to pursue university education at Oxford and Cambridge, creating pathways for social advancement that had previously been unavailable to Welsh families. Archaeological evidence from school buildings reveals the physical infrastructure that supported these educational activities, with specialised classrooms and library facilities that provided appropriate environments for scholarly pursuits. The technological innovations introduced during this period enhanced agricultural productivity and craft production capabilities that supported growing populations, while generating increased wealth for successful entrepreneurs. The improved agricultural techniques that became widespread during the 15th century included new crop rotation systems and livestock breeding programs that increased yields while maintaining soil fertility. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the adoption of these innovations through changes in field systems and farm building construction that accommodated new agricultural practices. The gradual decline of feudalism throughout the region reflected broader social and economic changes that reduced the importance of traditional military service obligations, while increasing the significance of commercial relationships and monetary transactions. The commutation of feudal services for money payments enabled landowners to employ hired labour while providing tenants with greater flexibility in their economic activities. Legal documents from this period reveal the systematic transformation of feudal obligations into commercial relationships that reflected changing concepts of property ownership and social responsibility. The administrative preparations for the eventual Acts of Union began during the early 16th century, as English officials recognised the practical advantages of systematic legal and administrative standardisation throughout Wales. The preliminary surveys and legal investigations conducted during this period created comprehensive documentation of existing jurisdictional arrangements and customary practices that would inform the legislative changes necessary for full integration. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres reveals expanded record-keeping facilities that supported these preparatory activities, while providing the institutional infrastructure necessary for implementing comprehensive administrative reforms. The Acts of Union, passed between 1536 and 1543, mark the formal end of the political entity that had evolved from the ancient Demetae through the Kingdom of Dyfed into the complex patchwork of marcher lordships. The legislation, drafted under Thomas Cromwell's supervision during Henry VIII's administrative reforms, systematically dismantled the jurisdictional autonomy that had characterised Welsh governance for over 4 centuries, while creating standardised county structures modelled on English administrative practices. The transformation of former dived territories into Pembrokeshire represented more than simple administrative reorganisation. It constituted the final phase of a millennium-long process that had gradually integrated the descendants of the Iron Age Demetae into the emerging British state system. The practical implementation of union required extensive surveys and legal investigations that documented existing territorial boundaries, customary practices, and property relationships throughout the region. Royal commissioners appointed to oversee this transition faced the complex task of reconciling overlapping jurisdictions that had evolved under Marcher lordship with the uniform administrative requirements of English county government. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres reveals the expansion of record-keeping facilities during the 1530s, with new archive buildings constructed to house the extensive documentation required for systematic territorial reorganisation. The Commissioner's reports, preserved in the National Archives, reveal the meticulous attention to detail that characterised this administrative transformation, with surveys that recorded everything from major landed estates to minor customary rights exercised by individual farmers. The establishment of Pembrokeshire as a formal English county required the creation of new governmental institutions that could administer justice and collect revenues according to standardised procedures, while accommodating the cultural and linguistic diversity that characterised local populations. The appointment of justices of the peace drawn from prominent local families provided continuity with existing social hierarchies, while introducing English legal procedures that gradually displaced the complex mixture of Welsh customary law and Norman feudal practices that had operated under Marcher lordship. Archaeological investigation of courthouse facilities reveals substantial construction projects during the mid-16th century, with purpose-built structures that provided appropriate venues for conducting legal proceedings according to English common law requirements. The linguistic implications of administrative union created challenges that persisted throughout the early modern period, as English became the mandatory language for all official business, while Welsh remained the primary means of communication for most rural populations. This requirement that all legal documents, court proceedings, and administrative records employ English terminology necessitated the development of translation services and bilingual administrative capabilities that enabled effective governance of predominantly Welsh-speaking communities. Legal records from the late 16th century reveal the gradual emergence of standardised translation procedures for Welsh customary terms and concepts that lack direct English equivalents, creating hybrid legal vocabularies that preserved certain aspects of Welsh legal tradition within English administrative frameworks. The social transformation that accompanied political union involved the systematic integration of Welsh gentry families into English governmental and social systems while preserving their local authority and cultural identity. The families who had achieved prominence during the late medieval period successfully adapted to union requirements by acquiring the English legal training and administrative expertise necessary for effective participation in county government. Archaeological evidence from gentry residences reveals substantial building projects during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with architectural modifications that incorporated English residential fashions while maintaining defensive features and Welsh decorative elements that demonstrated cultural continuity alongside political adaptation. The economic changes that resulted from administrative standardisation created new commercial opportunities while disrupting traditional economic relationships that had characterised Marcher lordship. The elimination of internal customs barriers and jurisdictional complications facilitated trade between Welsh producers and English markets, enabling agricultural and craft production to develop according to broader market demands rather than local consumption requirements. Archaeological evidence from market towns reveals significant expansion during the late 16th century, with new commercial buildings and improved transportation infrastructure that supported growing trade volumes between Wales and England. The preservation of Welsh cultural identity within the new administrative framework required careful negotiation between traditional practices and English governmental requirements. The gentry families who provided local leadership developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining Welsh cultural traditions while demonstrating loyalty to English administrative and religious systems. The manuscript collections maintained at gentry residences during the late 16th and early 17th centuries reveal systematic efforts to preserve Welsh genealogical traditions, historical narratives, and literary works that connected contemporary families to their ancient heritage while documenting their successful integration into English society. The antiquarian movement that emerged during the 18th century created new forms of scholarly interest in the ancient history of the Demetae and the medieval kingdom of Dyfed. Scholars like Edward Lewid and Lewis Morris conducted systematic investigations of archaeological sites, ancient monuments, and historical documents that had preserved information about pre-Norman Welsh society. Their research methods, though limited by contemporary archaeological techniques, established important precedents for historical investigation while creating comprehensive documentation of surviving evidence. Archaeological sites that had been neglected or misunderstood during previous centuries received detailed attention that preserved crucial information about ancient settlement patterns, defensive structures, and cultural practices. The Romantic revival of Welsh historical consciousness during the late 18th and early 19th centuries transformed scholarly antiquarianism into popular cultural movements that celebrated the heroic achievements of ancient Welsh kingdoms. The literary works of writers like Iolo Morgannwg, despite their problematic historical methodology, created compelling narratives that connected contemporary Welsh identity to the ancient rulers of Dyfed and other medieval kingdoms. These romantic interpretations, while often historically inaccurate, served crucial functions in preserving Welsh cultural identity during periods of increasing English cultural influence, while providing inspiration for political movements that sought greater Welsh autonomy within the British system. The archaeological investigations that began during the 19th century employed increasingly sophisticated techniques that revealed new information about Demetae society and the development of the Kingdom of Dyfed. The excavations conducted at sites like Castell Henlys and other Iron Age hill forts provided material evidence that complemented and sometimes contradicted the historical narratives preserved in medieval manuscripts. These archaeological discoveries revealed the complexity of pre-Roman Celtic society, while demonstrating the cultural continuity that connected the ancient Demetae to their medieval and modern descendants. The development of professional archaeology during the 20th century revolutionized understanding of Demetae culture and the historical development of Dyfed through systematic excavation and scientific analysis of material remains. The work of archaeologists like Mortimer Wheeler and later scholars established rigorous methodological standards that enabled detailed reconstruction of ancient settlement patterns, economic systems, and cultural practices. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Pembrokeshire revealed sophisticated Iron Age communities that possessed advanced metallurgical skills, extensive trade networks, and complex social organisations that challenged earlier assumptions about Celtic society. The establishment of Pembrokeshire as a national park in 1952 created institutional frameworks for preserving archaeological sites and historical monuments while promoting public understanding of the region's ancient heritage. The Park Authority's conservation programmes protected crucial archaeological sites from development pressure, while supporting research activities that continued revealing new information about Demetae culture and medieval Dyfed. The interpretive facilities developed at sites like Castell Henlys provided public access to archaeological evidence while maintaining rigorous scholarly standards that ensured accurate presentation of historical information. The cultural revival movements that emerged during the mid-20th century created new contexts for celebrating Demetae and Dyfed heritage as components of broader Welsh national identity. The establishment of Welsh language education programmes and cultural organisations provided institutional support for preserving and transmitting knowledge about ancient Welsh history while connecting contemporary communities to their ancestral heritage. Archaeological societies and historical groups throughout Pembrokeshire developed sophisticated research capabilities that contributed significantly to scholarly understanding while engaging public interest in local history. The modern scholarly reassessment of Demetae culture and Dyfed's historical significance has benefited from interdisciplinary approaches that combine archaeological evidence with historical linguistics, environmental archaeology, and comparative studies of Celtic societies throughout Europe. Recent research has revealed the international connections that characterise Demetae culture, with evidence of trade relationships extending from island to continental Europe and cultural influences that reflected participation in broader Celtic civilization. These investigations have demonstrated that the Demetae were not isolated tribal communities but sophisticated societies that maintained extensive networks of communication and exchange throughout the ancient world. The DNA studies and genealogical research conducted during recent decades have provided new insights into the demographic continuity that connects modern Welsh populations to their ancient predecessors. These scientific investigations have revealed that substantial proportions of contemporary Pembrokeshire residents possess genetic markers that indicate descent from pre-Roman Celtic populations, demonstrating remarkable demographic stability despite centuries of political transformation and cultural change. The genealogical traditions preserved in medieval manuscripts have proven remarkably accurate in documenting family relationships that extend back through the medieval period to ancient royal lineages. The contemporary cultural movements that celebrate Demetae and Dyfed heritage reflect both scholarly understanding of ancient history and emotional connections to ancestral identity that provide meaning and continuity for modern communities. The festivals, educational programs, and cultural organisations that promote awareness of ancient Welsh heritage serve crucial functions in maintaining cultural identity while providing economic benefits through heritage tourism and cultural industries. Archaeological sites throughout Pembrokeshire attract thousands of visitors annually who seek to understand their ancestral heritage while contributing to local economies that depend increasingly on cultural tourism. The preservation challenges that face archaeological sites and historical monuments require ongoing collaboration between governmental agencies, academic institutions, and local communities that share responsibility for protecting irreplaceable cultural resources. Climate change, development pressure, and natural erosion threaten many important sites, while limited funding restricts conservation activities that require specialised expertise and expensive interventions. The success of preservation efforts depends on maintaining public support for heritage protection, while developing sustainable funding mechanisms that can support long-term conservation programs. The educational initiatives that promote understanding of Demetae culture and Dyfed history have created new opportunities for connecting academic research to public engagement while inspiring new generations of scholars and cultural enthusiasts. University programs, museum exhibitions, and community education projects provide diverse pathways for learning about ancient Welsh history while maintaining rigorous scholarly standards that ensure accurate presentation of complex historical information. The digital resources developed by institutions like the National Museum Wales and various universities provide global access to archaeological evidence and historical documentation while supporting ongoing research activities. The international recognition that Pembrokeshire's archaeological heritage has achieved reflects both the intrinsic significance of Demetae culture and the quality of research and preservation efforts that have protected and interpreted these irreplaceable cultural resources. The designation of sites like St. David's as World Heritage locations acknowledges their outstanding universal value while creating international obligations for their protection and interpretation. These international connections provide opportunities for comparative research while attracting global attention to the remarkable cultural heritage that connects modern Wales to its ancient origins. The legacy of the Demetae and their successors in the Kingdom of Dyfed thus extends far beyond their immediate historical significance to encompass fundamental contributions to Welsh cultural identity and European Celtic heritage. Their sophisticated Iron Age society, successful adaptation to Roman rule, pioneering role in early Welsh Christianity, and political innovations during the medieval period established precedents and preserved traditions that continue influencing contemporary Welsh culture. The archaeological evidence that documents their achievements provides tangible connections to ancestral heritage, while supporting ongoing research that continues revealing new aspects of their remarkable civilization. The transformation from ancient Celtic tribe through medieval kingdom to modern county represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of cultural continuity and adaptation in European history. The survival of place names, genealogical traditions, and cultural practices across more than 2 millennia demonstrates the resilience of human communities while illustrating the complex processes through which ancient societies evolve into modern nations. The story of the Demetae and Dyfed thus provides not merely regional history, but fundamental insights into the nature of cultural identity, political development, and historical continuity that remain relevant for understanding contemporary social and political challenges. Today, as Wales continues developing its distinct identity, the heritage of the Demetae and Dyfed provides both inspiration and practical guidance for balancing cultural preservation with political adaptation. Their legacy reminds us that successful societies must maintain connections to their ancestral heritage while adapting creatively to changing circumstances, preserving essential cultural values while embracing beneficial innovations. The ancient tribe that emerged from the mists of prehistory to establish one of Wales's most enduring kingdoms continues providing wisdom for navigating the complexities of modern political and cultural development.